Imagine a great city floating on a lake at evening. Picture a wide shining lake, high in a ring of mountains, its surface catching the last gold of the setting sun, and rising from the water, joined to the shore by long straight causeways, a vast white city, its temples and palaces glowing rose and amber in the fading light. The water all around lies still and luminous, dotted with countless canoes gliding slowly home as the day ends, their wakes spreading in long silver lines across the calm. Tall pyramids rise from the heart of the city, their painted surfaces catching the sun, and from the summit of the greatest of them, a thread of smoke climbs straight into the windless evening air. Beyond the city, the lake stretches away to distant shores, and beyond the shores the great volcanoes stand against the darkening sky, their snow-capped peaks turned to fire and rose by the sinking sun. This is Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, one of the greatest cities in the world in its day, a city of perhaps 250,000 souls built upon an island in the middle of a mountain lake, laced with canals, joined to the land by broad causeways, fed by floating gardens, crowned with temples, and ruled by an emperor whose power stretched across much of what is now Mexico. Here, in this valley high among the mountains, a wandering people who had arrived as despised newcomers had risen, in scarcely 200 years, to build one of the mightiest empires the Americas had ever known. An empire of cities and tribute and gods, of warriors and priests and merchants, of astonishing art and learning and engineering, and of a religion of cosmic grandeur and terrible solemnity. And here, too, that empire would meet its end, suddenly and catastrophically, in one of the most dramatic and tragic collisions in all of human history. Tonight we will follow the whole of that story, the entire story of the Aztec Empire, from its humble and wandering beginnings to its glittering height and its sudden fall. We will go back to the misty origins of the Mexica, the people who would become the Aztecs, and follow them on their long migration in search of a promised home. We will witness the founding of Tenochtitlan upon its island, guided by an ancient prophecy and a sign of an eagle upon a cactus. We will watch the city rise from the waters of the lake, the causeways and canals, the floating gardens that fed 250,000 people, the great pyramids and palaces, and the teeming markets. We will come to know the people of this world, the emperor and the nobles, the priests and the warriors, the merchants who traveled to the edges of the known world, the farmers and craftsmen, and the ordinary families whose lives filled the city. We will explore the Aztec world entire, their society and its strict order, the great Triple Alliance and the machinery of empire and tribute, the long-distance merchants and the vast market where tens of thousands gathered to trade, the food and farming that sustained them, the maize and the chocolate and the bounty of the lake. We will enter their temples and learn of their gods. Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, the patron of the Mexica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, Tlaloc, the giver of rain. And we will try to understand their vision of the cosmos, their belief in the ages of the world and the 5 suns, their elaborate calendars, and the solemn and demanding religion at the heart of their lives. We will meet the eagle and jaguar warriors, hear of their arts and their poetry and their learning, and walk through the rhythm of their daily life. And then we will come to the great rulers, and to the height of the empire's power and splendor, and at last to its fall, to the strange omens that troubled the final years, to the coming of strangers from across the sea, to the meeting of the Emperor Moctezuma and the Spanish captain Cortez, and to the swift and terrible chain of events that brought the mightiest empire of the Americas crashing down in the space of 2 short years, and ended forever the world we will have come to know. It is one of the great stories of human history, a tale of a civilization that rose from nothing to magnificence, and fell from magnificence to ruin, leaving behind only ruins and memory, and a handful of painted books. So settle in, and let us go back 500 years and more, to a high valley ringed by mountains and filled with a shining lake, and to the great white city that once floated upon its waters, in the days when the Aztec Empire stood at the height of its glory, before the strangers came. Before we set out, a quiet word. If you find some comfort in these long journeys into the past, you might take a moment to leave a like and to follow along with the channel, but only if these stories are truly yours, only if the telling brings you something. It is a small thing, and it helps other wanderers, lying awake in the dark in distant places, to find their way here too. And if you feel like it, you might leave a word below to say where you are listening from tonight, your city, and the hour it is where you are. There is a quiet pleasure in knowing that someone, in another city and another hour of the night, is lying still and listening to the very same story. But there is nothing you need to do. The only thing that matters now is the tale itself, and the shining lake, and the white city glowing in the last of the evening sun. So let us begin where the Aztecs themselves would have begun, not with the city and its glory, but long before it, in the time of wandering, when the people who would build it were still searching for their home. But first, let us pause to understand how we know this story at all, and the world into which the Aztecs were born. Before we follow the Aztecs on their long road to greatness, we should pause to ask how their story comes down to us, for it reaches us by a strange and difficult path, through the memory of a conquered people and the records of those who conquered them, and this shapes much of what we know and do not know about the world we are about to enter. The story of the Aztecs is not like the story of peoples who left great libraries of their own writing. It is a story partly recovered, partly reconstructed, pieced together from fragments that survived a catastrophe. The Aztecs were not without writing and record. They kept books, beautiful painted books called codices, made of bark paper or deerskin, folded like screens, covered in vivid pictures and symbols that recorded their history, their calendars, their gods and rituals, their tribute rolls and genealogies and maps. Their scribes and priests were trained to read and recite these books, which served as the memory of the civilization, the repository of its history and knowledge. But the Aztec system of writing was not a full alphabet like ours. It was a sophisticated combination of pictures, symbols and signs that recorded names, dates, places and events, and that worked together with a trained memory, the books prompting the reciter, who knew the fuller story by heart. The painted books and the trained memory together preserved the knowledge of the Aztec world, and then came catastrophe. When the Spanish conquered the Aztec Empire, an enormous destruction followed, not only of lives and buildings, but of books and knowledge. In the years of the conquest and after, the great majority of the Aztec codices were destroyed, burned as the works of a pagan religion, deliberately wiped out, so that of the vast libraries of the Aztec world, only a tiny handful of pre-conquest books survived, scattered now in collections around the world. An almost unimaginable loss of knowledge occurred. The memory of a whole civilization, painted in its books, largely consigned to the flames. What we have lost we can scarcely guess at. Whole libraries of history and poetry and knowledge vanished. And yet, remarkably, much was also saved, and saved, often, through an unexpected collaboration. In the decades after the conquest, some among the Spanish, especially certain friars who came to convert the Aztecs and who became fascinated by the world they were helping to destroy, set out to record everything they could about the old ways before the last people who remembered them passed away. The greatest of these was a friar who spent decades interviewing elderly Aztecs who had grown up before the conquest, working with native scribes and artists, compiling an enormous encyclopedia of Aztec life, religion, history, and language, a vast record written in both Spanish and the Aztec language, illustrated by native artists, that is our single greatest source for the Aztec world. Other Spaniards who had taken part in the conquest wrote their own accounts of what they had seen: the great city, its markets and temples, the emperor and his court, leaving us vivid eyewitness descriptions of Tenochtitlan in its last days of glory. And native writers too, in the years after the conquest, set down the history and traditions of their people, sometimes in their own language, written in the Spanish alphabet they had learned, preserving the memory of the world that had been lost. So the story of the Aztecs comes to us through this strange and difficult mixture of sources: the few surviving painted books, the great post-conquest compilations made by friars working with native informants, the eyewitness accounts of the conquerors, the histories set down by native writers after the fall, and, increasingly in modern times, the findings of archaeology, as the buried remains of the Aztec world, and above all the great temple at the heart of Tenochtitlan, uncovered in the very center of modern Mexico City, have been excavated and studied. From all these sources together, scholars have reconstructed the Aztec world, though always with gaps and uncertainties, always aware that much was lost, always conscious that we see this civilization partly through the eyes of those who destroyed it. It is a story recovered from catastrophe, a world half remembered, pieced together from what survived the burning of the books. And with that in mind, aware of how much we know and how much we have lost, let us go back to the beginning, to the land where this story unfolds, and to the wandering people who would build the great city on the lake. The story of the Aztecs unfolds in a particular and remarkable place, a high valley in the heart of what is now Mexico, ringed by mountains, filled in those days by a great system of shallow lakes, a landscape unlike almost any other, and one that would shape everything about the civilization that arose there. To understand the Aztecs, we must first understand the Valley of Mexico, the cradle of their world. The Valley of Mexico is a great basin high in the mountains, more than 2,000 meters above the sea, surrounded on all sides by mountain ranges and crowned by towering volcanoes whose snow-capped peaks stand against the sky. It is high, cool country, not tropical lowland but temperate highland, with clear, thin air and a mild climate, bright by day and cold by night. And in the days of the Aztecs, the floor of this great basin was filled by a system of 5 interconnected lakes, a vast, shallow sheet of water covering much of the valley floor, fed by the streams and rainfall of the surrounding mountains, with no outlet to the sea, so that the water gathered and spread across the lowlands of the basin. Some of these lakes were freshwater, fed by mountain streams. Others were brackish and salty, where the water grew still and evaporated. Around and among the lakes lay marshes and reed beds and fertile shores. This watery valley was the stage on which the Aztec drama would play out, and its lakes were central to everything. They provided fish and waterfowl and the creatures of the marsh. They provided water for the floating gardens that would feed the great city. They provided highways of transport, for in a world without draft animals or wheeled vehicles, the canoe was the great mover of goods, and the lakes and canals allowed food and tribute and trade to flow easily to the island city. The lakes both protected and nourished the city that would rise at their heart, a city that could be reached only by causeways, that could be defended or cut, and that was fed and supplied by the canoes that plied the waters. The whole Aztec civilization was, in a sense, a civilization of the lake, built upon it, fed by it, defended by it, shaped by it at every turn. In the centuries after the conquest, the Spanish would drain the lakes, seeking to control the flooding that plagued the city they built upon the ruins of Tenochtitlan. And today the Great Lakes are almost entirely gone, and modern Mexico City sprawls across the dry bed of the vanished waters, sinking slowly into the soft lake-bed soil. The shining lake world of the Aztecs has disappeared from the earth, but in their day, the valley was a world of water, and the city floated upon it. The Valley of Mexico was a rich and desirable land, and it had been inhabited and contested for a very long time before the Aztecs came. It lay at the heart of a wider world, the world that scholars call Mesoamerica, the great zone of high civilization that stretched across central and southern Mexico and into Central America, where for thousands of years a succession of brilliant civilizations had risen and flourished and fallen, sharing many common features: the cultivation of maize, the building of pyramids, elaborate calendars and writing, complex religions, great cities and states. The Aztecs were the heirs of this ancient Mesoamerican tradition, latecomers to a world that was already old, that had already seen the rise and fall of mighty civilizations whose ruins the Aztecs themselves looked upon with awe. To understand the Aztecs, we must understand that they were not the first, but the last in a long line, the inheritors of an ancient and sophisticated world. And so, before the Aztecs themselves, let us look briefly at those who came before them, whose legacy they inherited and revered. The Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico as latecomers, into a land already old in civilization, already filled with the ruins and memories of mighty peoples who had gone before. And the Aztecs knew this. They looked upon the works of their predecessors with wonder and reverence, claimed descent and inheritance from them, and built their own identity upon the legacy of these earlier civilizations. To understand the world the Aztecs inherited, we must know something of those who came before. Long before the Aztecs, there had risen in the Valley of Mexico one of the greatest cities of the ancient Americas, a vast metropolis whose ruins still stand, whose enormous pyramids tower over the landscape to this day. This was Teotihuacan, a huge and powerful city that had flourished many centuries before the Aztecs came, in the early centuries of the Common Era, a planned city of great avenues and towering pyramids, home to 100,000 people or more, the center of a wide-reaching influence, one of the largest cities in the entire world in its day. Its great Pyramid of the Sun and Pyramid of the Moon, rising beside its Grand Avenue, were among the largest structures ever built in the ancient Americas. But Teotihuacan had risen and fallen long before the Aztecs. By the time the Aztecs came, it had been a ruin for centuries, its builders vanished, its very name forgotten. The Aztecs, gazing upon its colossal pyramids, were so awed that they believed it must have been built by the gods, or by a race of giants, in the age before the present world. They gave it the name by which we still know it, Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were made, or the place of becoming a god, and they made pilgrimages to it, revered it as a sacred place, a relic of a divine age. The Aztecs walked among ruins they could not explain, and wove them into their own mythology. Closer to the Aztecs in time, and even more important to their sense of themselves, was another people, the Toltecs, who had flourished in central Mexico in the centuries between the fall of Teotihuacan and the rise of the Aztecs. The Toltecs, centered on their capital, became in Aztec memory the very model of civilization, refinement, and artistic achievement, a golden age of culture, craftsmanship, and wisdom. To the Aztecs, the Toltecs represented the pinnacle of civilized accomplishment. The very word for a skilled craftsman or artist in the Aztec language derived from the name of the Toltecs, so that to be Toltec was to be a master of the arts of civilization. The Aztecs looked back on the Toltec age as a lost golden age, and they were eager to claim descent and inheritance from the Toltecs. For to be heirs of the Toltecs was to be heirs of civilization itself, to have a right to rule, to belong to the great tradition. Aztec rulers traced their legitimacy to Toltec ancestry. The prestige of the Toltec name conferred authority and cultural standing. It was from this Toltec tradition, too, that the Aztecs inherited some of their most important religious and cultural traditions, among them the figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a god and a culture hero deeply associated with the Toltecs, around whom gathered legends that would later play a strange and fateful role in the story of the conquest. The Toltec world, like Teotihuacan before it, had risen and fallen before the Aztecs came into their power. The Aztecs were the inheritors of a world that had already seen great civilizations come and go. They were intensely aware of this, aware that they were latecomers, parvenus, a once despised people who had risen to power in a land full of the ruins and memories of greater and older peoples, and this awareness shaped them. It made them eager to claim the prestige of the past, to link themselves to the Toltecs and the ancient tradition, to prove themselves worthy heirs of the civilization they had inherited. The Aztecs would build an empire greater than any their predecessors had known, but they would always look back, with reverence and longing, to the golden ages that had come before. And now, with the ancient world sketched, let us turn to the Aztecs themselves, to their own beginnings, in the time of wandering, before they had any greatness at all. The people who would become the Aztecs called themselves the Mexica, and their own histories told that they had not always lived in the Valley of Mexico, but had come there after long wandering from a distant homeland in the north. The story of their origins and their long migration is one of the great founding legends of the Aztec world, part history, part myth, a tale of a wandering people led by their god toward a promised home. Whatever its precise historical truth, it was the story the Aztecs told about themselves, the story of how they came to be. The Mexica remembered that their ancestral homeland was a place called Aztlan, a name that means something like the place of herons or the place of whiteness, and from which, in fact, comes the name Aztec, meaning people of Aztlan. Aztlan was remembered as an island in a lake, somewhere far to the north, a detail that is striking, for the home they would eventually find and build, Tenochtitlan, would also be an island in a lake, as if the wanderers sought, all along, to recreate the home they had left. From this northern homeland, the Mexica believed they had set out long ago on a great migration, journeying southward over many years in search of a new home. One of several wandering peoples who came down from the north into the rich lands of central Mexico. The Mexica were, in their own telling, among the last and the least of these wandering peoples, rough, poor, despised newcomers, arriving late into a land already settled and civilized. What drove their migration, the Mexica said, was the command of their god, Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, the patron and protector of the Mexica, who led and guided them on their long journey. According to the legends, the Mexica carried with them an image or bundle of their god, and the god spoke to them through his priests, directing their wandering, telling them when to move and when to stop, guiding them toward the promised home he had ordained for them. Huitzilopochtli had promised his people that he would lead them to a place where they would found a great city and rise to rule over all the lands around, that they, the despised wanderers, were a chosen people destined for greatness, if they followed their god and endured the long hardship of the journey. This sense of being a chosen people, led by their god toward a destined greatness, was central to the Mexica identity, and it would drive them through all the hardships of their rise. The migration was long and hard, lasting, in the traditional accounts, for generations. The Mexica wandering through the lands of central Mexico, stopping for years in one place and then moving on at the god's command, suffering hardship and hostility, despised and driven off by the settled peoples whose lands they entered. They were newcomers and outsiders, poor and rough, without land of their own, surviving as they could, sometimes serving more powerful peoples as mercenaries or laborers, always searching for the promised place where they could finally settle and build. They were not welcome. The settled peoples of the valley looked down on them as crude barbarians, and again the Mexica were driven from the lands they tried to occupy, forced to move on, to keep searching, for a wandering people with a grand destiny but no home. The journey was a long ordeal of rejection and endurance, but they pressed on, sustained by the promise of their God, looking always for the sign that would tell them they had found their home at last. And that sign, when it came, would be one of the most famous images in all of Mexican history. The long migration of the Mexica came at last to its end in the Valley of Mexico, but not easily, and not at once. For even when they reached the valley that was to be their home, they were still despised newcomers with no land of their own, and they would have to endure further hardship and humiliation before they found, at last, the sign their God had promised, and founded the city that would become the heart of their empire. The founding of Tenochtitlan is the climax of the Aztec origin story, and one of the most enduring symbols of Mexico to this day. When the Mexica arrived in the Valley of Mexico, they found it already settled, a crowded land of established city-states, ringed around the lakes, each with its own ruler and territory, the desirable land already claimed and occupied. The Mexica, as newcomers, were unwelcome, and could find no place of their own. For a time they were allowed to settle on the lands of more powerful neighbors, but as subordinates and servants, despised and exploited, tolerated only as long as they were useful. They served as mercenaries, fighting in the wars of their overlords. They endured contempt and mistreatment, and eventually, according to the traditions, their presence became intolerable to their hosts, through some quarrel or offense or act of defiance, and they were driven out once more, forced to flee into the most undesirable refuge available, the marshes and reed beds and swampy islands of the lake itself, the empty, unwanted, watery margins that no one else had claimed. And it was there, in the marshes of the lake, that the sign finally came. For Huitzilopochtli had prophesied that the Mexica would know the site of their destined city by a particular and unmistakable omen. They would see an eagle perched upon a nopal cactus, a prickly pear cactus growing from the rock. And there, where the eagle sat upon the cactus, they were to found their city. And as the Mexica wandered through the marshes, searching, they came at last upon the very sign. There, on a small rocky island in the lake, grew a nopal cactus, and upon the cactus perched a great eagle, just as the god had foretold. In the most famous later versions of the legend, the eagle holds a writhing serpent in its beak or talons, the image that would become, centuries later, the emblem at the heart of the flag of modern Mexico. The Mexica knew that their long wandering was over. This was the place their God had promised. Here they would build their home. And so, upon that small island in the lake, unwanted, marshy, marginal land that no one else had claimed, the Mexica founded their city, which they named Tenochtitlan. The traditional date given for the founding is the year 1325, though the precise date is uncertain. It was a humble and unpromising beginning, a few huts of reeds and mud on a swampy island, a refuge of the desperate and the despised, with little to suggest that this would become one of the greatest cities in the world. The Mexica had no good land, no resources, nothing but a marshy island, and the conviction that their God had led them there for a great destiny. But the location, unpromising as it seemed, held hidden advantages that would prove decisive. The island was defensible, protected by the surrounding water. It sat at the heart of a system of lakes that formed natural highways for canoe transport, and the lake itself, once mastered, could be made astonishingly productive through the techniques of farming the Mexica would develop. From this humble and desperate beginning, a refuge of outcasts on an unwanted island, would grow, in less than 2 centuries, the magnificent capital of an empire. But that rise was still to come. For now, the Mexica were a small, poor, newly settled people, clinging to their island, beginning the long work of building a home and a destiny out of the marshes of the lake. The founding of Tenochtitlan on its marshy island was only the beginning. The true marvel was what the Mexica made of that unpromising place over the generations that followed. For they transformed a swampy island into one of the largest and most beautiful cities in the world, through feats of engineering and ingenuity that astonished all who saw them. The building of Tenochtitlan upon the water is one of the great achievements of human civilization, and we should pause to understand how it was done. The first and greatest challenge was simply to make more land, for the island was small, and a great city needed room to grow. The Mexica solved this through a brilliant technique of land reclamation. They built up new ground from the shallow lake bed itself, driving stakes and weaving wattle to enclose rectangular plots in the shallows, then filling them with mud dredged from the lake bottom and with vegetation, building up the enclosed plots until they rose above the water as new, solid, astonishingly fertile islands of made land. These were the chinampas, the so-called floating gardens, though they did not in fact float but were rooted to the lake bed, and they served a double purpose. They extended the land of the city, and they created farmland of extraordinary productivity. We will return to the chinampas as farms, but as engineering, they were the means by which the Mexica literally built their city outward across the lake, plot by plot, expanding the island into a great urban expanse, laced with canals between the made-up blocks of land. For the city that grew was a city of water as much as of land, a city laced throughout with canals, so that like Venice in the Old World, Tenochtitlan was a city where canoes glided along watery streets between the blocks of houses and gardens, where much of the movement of people and goods was by water. Broad canals served as major thoroughfares, smaller channels threaded between the chinampas and the houses, and the canoe was the universal vehicle, carrying people and produce and goods throughout the city and across the lake to the shore. Interspersed with the canals were streets and walkways of solid ground, so that the city could be traversed by land as well as water. A remarkable hybrid of land and water, canal and street, garden and building, and the city was joined to the mainland by its great causeways, broad raised roads built out across the water, connecting the island city to the various points on the surrounding shore, wide enough for many people to walk abreast, carrying the foot traffic between the city and the land. These causeways were among the most impressive features of Tenochtitlan, marvels of engineering striding across the open water, and they were vital to the city's life, and, as it would turn out, to its defense and its fate, for they were the only land approaches to the island and could be defended, or cut, or broken by removable bridges at intervals. The causeways also served another purpose. Some of them functioned as dikes, helping to control the waters of the lake and to separate the fresh water around the city from the brackish water elsewhere, for the management of water was a constant challenge and a constant achievement in Tenochtitlan. The Mexica built great dikes to control flooding, and to keep the salty water of one lake from mixing with the fresh water around the city. They built aqueducts to bring fresh drinking water from springs on the mainland into the city, for the lake water around the growing city was not good to drink. They managed the levels and the quality of the water through an elaborate system of dikes and channels and sluices, a sophisticated hydraulic engineering that kept the lake city livable and productive. All of this, the chinampas, the canals, the causeways, the dikes, the aqueducts, represented an extraordinary mastery of a difficult environment, the transformation of a swampy lake into the foundation of a magnificent city. The Mexica had taken the unwanted marshes that were all they had been allowed, and had made of them, through ingenuity and labor, a place of beauty and abundance and power. And as the engineering mastered the lake, the city upon it grew, and the people who built it grew with it, from despised refugees into the masters of a valley, and then of an empire. As the Mexica rose from poverty to power, and Tenochtitlan grew from a refuge into a metropolis, their society developed into a complex and highly ordered structure, a hierarchical world of nobles and commoners, priests and warriors, merchants and craftsmen and farmers and slaves, each with their place and their role, bound together in an elaborate social order. To understand the Aztec world, we must understand the structure of its society, the ranks and classes and roles that ordered the lives of its people. At the summit of Aztec society stood the ruler, the Tlatoani, a word meaning he who speaks, the supreme lord of Tenochtitlan, who was at once king, high priest, war leader, and the living embodiment of the state. The Tlatoani was a figure of immense majesty and authority, surrounded by elaborate ceremony, regarded as semi-divine, the link between the people and the gods, the supreme ruler whose word was law. He was chosen from among the royal family by a council of nobles, not strictly by hereditary succession from father to son, but selected from the royal lineage for his fitness to rule, often a brother or nephew of the previous ruler. Around the Tlatoani stood the high nobility, the great lords, the royal family, the senior officials and generals and priests who governed the empire and counseled the ruler. Below the supreme ruler and the high nobility stood the broad class of the nobles, the Pippleton, the hereditary aristocracy, who held the high offices of state, religion, and the military, who owned land and enjoyed privileges denied to commoners, who were educated in special schools and lived in fine houses and wore fine clothes and ornaments that marked their rank. The nobility provided the rulers, the priests, the high military commanders, the judges and administrators of the empire. Their status was hereditary, passed down through noble lineages, though it had to be confirmed by service and achievement. Nobility brought privilege, but also obligation, the duty to serve the state in war, religion, and government. The great mass of the population were the commoners, the Maceholten, the ordinary free people who made up the bulk of Aztec society. The farmers, fishermen, artisans, laborers, and soldiers who did the work of the world. The commoners were organized into local units, kinship-based neighborhood groups called calpulli, each with its own land, its own local temple and school, its own leaders and identity, which formed the basic building blocks of Aztec society. A commoner belonged to his calpulli, farmed land allotted by it, worshipped at its temple, was educated in its school, fought in its military unit, and found his place in the world through it. The calpulli organized the life of the common people, distributing land, organizing labor and military service and tribute, providing the local community within which ordinary lives unfolded. Below the commoners were those of lesser status, landless laborers who worked the lands of others, and slaves. Slavery in the Aztec world was a particular institution, different from the chattel slavery of some other societies. People became slaves through debt, through crime and its punishment, through selling themselves or their children in times of desperate poverty, or through capture. But Aztec slaves had certain rights, could own property, and even own other slaves, could marry, could sometimes buy or win their freedom, and their children were generally born free. It was a servitude that was often temporary and conditional, a way of dealing with debt and poverty and crime, rather than a permanent hereditary degradation. Above and apart from the ordinary structure stood certain special groups: the powerful guild of long-distance merchants, the priesthood, the skilled craftsmen of luxury goods, each with its own organization and status. Together, these ranks and classes formed the elaborate order of Aztec society, a hierarchical, disciplined, intricately organized world in which each person had a place and a role, bound together under the rule of the Tlatoani and the nobility, all serving the collective enterprise of the Mexica state as it rose toward empire. At the heart of Aztec life, beneath the grand structures of state and empire, lay the family and the local community, and the Aztecs gave great attention to the raising and education of their children, with a system of schooling and moral instruction remarkable for its rigor and its reach. To understand how ordinary Aztec lives were shaped, we should look at the family, childhood, and the education of the young. The Aztec family was the basic unit of society, and family life was governed by a strict moral code and a strong sense of duty and order. Marriage was an important institution, often arranged with the help of matchmakers, marked by elaborate ceremony, and intended to bind families and to produce children and order the transmission of property and status. The household might be a single family, or an extended one, several generations or related families living together, and within it each member had their roles and duties. Aztec moral teaching laid great stress on order, discipline, moderation, hard work, respect for elders and authority, and the avoidance of excess and vice, a austere and demanding ethic that shaped the upbringing of the young. The birth of a child was surrounded with ceremony, ritual, and meaning. The newborn was greeted with formal speeches, washed and dedicated with prayers, and its fate was read in the signs of the calendar. For the day of one's birth, in the elaborate Aztec calendar, was believed to carry a destiny, a fortune good or ill, which shaped the child's life. The child was named in ceremony, and from the earliest years was trained in the duties and skills appropriate to its station and sex, boys learning the work of men, girls the work of women, all learning the strict moral code and the disciplined habits the Aztecs prized. And then, remarkably for the ancient world, Aztec children, it seems, all children, not only the nobility, went to school. For the Aztecs maintained a system of compulsory education that reached across the society. There were two main kinds of school. The children of nobles, and some especially promising commoners, attended the Kalmakak, the elite schools, attached to the temples, run by priests, which provided a rigorous and demanding education in religion, history, writing, and the reading of the codices, astronomy and the calendar, law, rhetoric, and the fine speech the Aztecs valued, and the knowledge needed for the high offices of priesthood, government, and command. The Karmakak was a school of severe discipline and high learning, training the future leaders, priests, and rulers of the Aztec world. The children of commoners attended the Telpocali, the House of Youth, the local school run by each Kolpuli, which provided a more practical education focused on military training, civic duty, history and religion, and the skills of work and war, preparing ordinary young people to be soldiers, workers, and citizens. The education in both kinds of school was strict and demanding, emphasizing discipline, endurance, moral instruction, religious devotion, and the duties of the citizen. Young people were trained to hardship and self-control, taught the history and traditions and moral code of their people, prepared for their roles in war, work, religion, and society. The Aztecs valued eloquence and fine speech highly, and much instruction was given in the elegant, formal, metaphor-rich rhetoric they admired. They valued discipline and order, and the schools instilled these relentlessly. This widespread, organized, compulsory education, reaching even the children of commoners, in an age when schooling was a rare privilege almost everywhere in the world, is one of the most striking features of Aztec civilization, a mark of how seriously they took the ordering and shaping of their society and the transmission of their culture to the young. From the family and the school emerged the disciplined, dutiful, devout citizens who filled the ranks of the Aztec world, the warriors and priests and workers and mothers who sustained the great enterprise of the Mexica state. The rise of the Mexica from despised refugees to masters of an empire did not happen all at once, nor by their efforts alone. It came about through a combination of military prowess, shrewd alliance, and political cunning, and its decisive moment was the formation of a great alliance of 3 cities that became the engine of Aztec imperial power. To understand how the Aztec Empire was built, we must understand the Triple Alliance. For the first century or so after the founding of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica remained a subordinate people, settled now on their island, growing in numbers and strength, but still subject to more powerful neighbors, serving as vassals and mercenaries to the dominant city-states of the valley, paying tribute, fighting in others' wars. They were building their strength, learning the arts of war and statecraft, growing their city, but they were not yet masters of their own destiny, let alone of others. The valley in those days was dominated by other powers, and the Mexica were among their subjects and servants. But the Mexica were growing stronger, and they were ambitious, and they bided their time. The turning point came in the early 15th century, when the dominant power of the valley overreached and faltered, and the subject peoples, the Mexica among them, seized the chance to throw off their overlords. In a war that reshaped the politics of the valley, the Mexica and their allies overthrew the dominant power, broke its hold, and emerged as masters in its place. And out of this upheaval came the alliance that would build the empire, the Triple Alliance, a coalition of 3 city-states: Tenochtitlan, the city of the Mexica; Texcoco, a center of culture and learning on the eastern shore of the lake; and Tlacopan, a smaller city to the west. These 3 cities bound themselves together in alliance, agreeing to make war together and to share the spoils and tribute of conquest, and together they set out to dominate the valley and then to expand far beyond it. The Triple Alliance was the political foundation of the Aztec Empire, and for the rest of its history the empire was, formally, the joint enterprise of these 3 allied cities, though Tenochtitlan and the Mexica, growing ever more powerful, came increasingly to dominate the alliance, until they were its clear leaders, and the empire was, in effect, theirs. The 3 cities shared in the wars and the tribute, by an agreed division, with Tenochtitlan and Texcoco taking the larger shares, and Tlacopan a smaller one. Together, they formed a powerful military and political combination, and they used it to embark on a career of conquest that would, over the following century, build one of the greatest empires the Americas had ever seen. The genius of the Triple Alliance lay partly in this pooling of strength, and partly in the political skill with which it was led, for the rulers of the allied cities, and especially of Tenochtitlan, proved to be shrewd and capable statesmen as well as war leaders. They reorganized and strengthened their state, reformed their society and their army, cultivated their alliances, and pursued a deliberate policy of expansion. Under a series of able and ambitious rulers, the alliance grew from the dominant power of the valley into the master of a vast empire, extending its conquests ever farther afield, drawing an ever wider world into its net of tribute and domination. The despised wanderers had become the rulers of the valley. Now they would become the rulers of an empire. And the engine that drove that empire, The system by which the Aztecs ruled and exploited the lands they conquered was the system of tribute, to which we now turn. The Aztec Empire was not an empire in quite the way we might imagine. Not a unified state with uniform laws and administration imposed upon conquered lands, but rather a vast network of tribute, a system by which the dominant alliance compelled the peoples it conquered to send regular payments of goods to their overlords, while otherwise often leaving them to govern themselves. To understand the Aztec Empire, we must understand this system of tribute and conquest, the machinery by which the Mexica grew rich and powerful on the labor and goods of the lands they subdued. The fundamental aim of Aztec conquest was tribute, the regular payment of goods extracted from conquered peoples and sent to the imperial capitals. When the Aztecs conquered a region, they did not usually occupy it with garrisons, replace its rulers, or impose their own administration in detail. Instead, they typically left the local rulers in place and the local society intact, but compelled them to acknowledge Aztec overlordship and, above all, to pay tribute, regular shipments of goods sent at fixed intervals to Tenochtitlan and the allied capitals. This tribute was the lifeblood of the empire, the purpose of conquest, the source of the wealth that filled the capital and sustained its nobility and its splendor. And the tribute that flowed into Tenochtitlan was vast and various, drawn from all the many lands and climates of the empire. From the conquered provinces came food in enormous quantities, maize, beans, and other staples that fed the great city. Came cloth and clothing, vast quantities of woven cotton mantles and garments, which served almost as a form of currency. Came luxury goods and raw materials of every kind, gold and precious stones, jade and turquoise, the brilliant feathers of tropical birds, prized above almost anything for the magnificent featherwork the Aztecs made, cacao, the precious chocolate beans that were both a luxury drink and a form of money, rubber, paper, incense, jaguar skins and exotic goods, war gear and craft goods, and the products of distant lands. The tribute rolls, some of which survive, recorded in the painted books, list in meticulous detail the staggering quantities and varieties of goods that each conquered province was required to send, an inventory of the wealth of an empire flowing toward its center. This system made Tenochtitlan immensely rich and the Mexica immensely powerful, but it also had its weaknesses, which would prove important in the end. Because the empire ruled largely through tribute and intimidation, rather than through direct administration and integration, the conquered peoples were not bound to the empire by loyalty or common identity, but held in subjection by force and the fear of force, resentful of the tribute burden, often longing to throw off their overlords. The empire was a structure of domination, not of unity. A great many subject peoples paying tribute under compulsion to a dominant alliance they hated and feared. Many conquered peoples bitterly resented Aztec rule and the heavy tribute, and some, like the fiercely independent peoples whom the Aztecs never fully subdued, who remained hostile on the empire's borders, waited only for a chance to strike back. This resentment among the subject peoples was the great hidden weakness of the empire, and when the moment of crisis came, it would prove fatal. For when strangers arrived who were willing to make war on the Aztecs, they would find a vast supply of allies among the peoples who hated Aztec domination. But that lay in the future. For now, the system of tribute made the Aztecs rich and mighty, and the goods of 100 conquered lands flowed into the great city on the lake, filling its storehouses and adorning its nobility, the visible sign of an empire at the height of its power. Among the most fascinating and important groups in Aztec society were the Pochteca, the long-distance merchants, the professional traders who traveled enormous distances across Mesoamerica, beyond the borders of the empire, to bring back the precious goods of distant lands. The Pochteca were a remarkable institution, a privileged and powerful guild whose members were traders, explorers, and, often, spies, and whose activities knit together the commerce of a vast region. To understand the Aztec economy and its reach, we must understand these merchants who walked to the edges of the known world. The Pochteca were professional long-distance traders, organized into a tight-knit and hereditary guild with its own laws, customs, gods, and privileges, occupying a special and somewhat ambiguous place in Aztec society, wealthy and powerful, enjoying privileges that approached those of the nobility, yet not themselves noble, careful to conceal their wealth lest they provoke the envy or suspicion of the true aristocracy. They organized great trading expeditions that traveled far beyond the borders of the empire, into distant lands, carrying goods to trade and bringing back the precious products of far regions, the brilliant tropical feathers, the jade and turquoise and other precious stones, the cacao, the jaguar skins, and all the luxury goods that the nobility of Tenochtitlan craved and that could not be obtained nearby. These trading expeditions were arduous and dangerous undertakings, long journeys on foot, for there were no pack animals or wheeled vehicles, through difficult and often hostile country, far from the protection of the empire, carrying valuable goods through lands where the traders might be robbed or killed. The Pochteca travelled in organized caravans, armed and prepared to defend themselves, sometimes fighting their way through hostile territory. They were tough, brave, resourceful men, and their expeditions could last many months and cover vast distances. They carried goods from the empire, fine textiles, craft goods, and other products, to trade in distant markets, and returned laden with the precious goods of far lands on which they grew wealthy. And the Pochteca served the empire in another capacity as well, as the eyes and ears of the state in distant lands, travelling far beyond the borders, into independent and hostile regions. The merchants gathered information on the wealth, the strength, the politics, the vulnerabilities of distant peoples, and brought it back to the rulers of Tenochtitlan. They served, in effect, as spies and scouts, their trading expeditions doubling as intelligence-gathering missions, scouting out lands that the empire might later conquer. Sometimes the Pochteca were themselves the occasion or the pretext for conquest. If merchants were attacked or killed in some distant land, the empire might use this as justification for war and conquest, sending its armies to avenge the merchants and subdue the offending region. The merchants thus extended the reach and the knowledge of the empire far beyond its formal borders, knitting together the commerce of Mesoamerica and serving as the advanced scouts of imperial expansion. Wealthy, privileged, brave, and useful, organized into their powerful guild, the Pochteca were among the most distinctive and important figures of the Aztec world. The traders who walked to the edge of the world and back, bringing the riches of distant lands to the great city on the lake. If the tribute system and the long-distance merchants brought the wealth of an empire to Tenochtitlan, it was in the great market that this wealth was displayed and exchanged. And the markets of the Aztec capital, above all the vast market of Tlaxcala, astonished all who saw them, including the Spanish, who declared they had never seen anything to equal it in all of Europe. The great market is one of the most vivid images we have of the Aztec world at its height, and it is worth lingering there, among the crowds and the goods, to feel the abundance and the order of that civilization. Tlatelolco was the sister city to Tenochtitlan, built on an adjacent island and eventually merged with it, and it was home to the greatest market in the Aztec world, an enormous marketplace, a vast open plaza surrounded by arcades, where, on the great market days, tens of thousands of people gathered to buy and sell. The Spanish who saw it were astonished by its size and order, estimating that 20, 40, 60,000 people might gather there on a busy day, a multitude trading in a marketplace larger and better ordered than anything they knew in Europe, a scene of staggering abundance and bustle and variety, and the goods on offer were of every conceivable kind, for everything the vast empire produced flowed into this market. There were foods of every sort, maize and beans and squash, the staples of life, chilies and tomatoes and 100 vegetables and fruits, turkeys and dogs raised for meat, fish and frogs and waterfowl and the creatures of the lake, honey and salt and every kind of foodstuff. There was cacao, the precious chocolate. There were textiles, cotton cloth and clothing of every quality, from coarse fibre to the finest woven and embroidered mantles. There were craft goods of every kind, pottery and baskets and mats, tools and weapons, goods of wood and stone and bone and reed. There were luxury goods, gold and silver work, jade and turquoise and precious stones, the brilliant featherwork, fine ornaments and jewellery. There were raw materials, building stone and lime and timber, obsidian, the volcanic glass from which the Aztecs made their razor-sharp blades, dyes and pigments, medicines and herbs. There were animals and birds, there were slaves, there was, it was said, virtually everything that the world of the Aztecs produced, gathered in one vast marketplace. And the market was not a chaos, but a highly ordered institution. The goods were arranged by type, each kind of merchandise in its own section, so that buyers could find what they sought. A whole quarter for foodstuffs, another for cloth, another for pottery, and so on. The great market laid out in an orderly arrangement. Trade was conducted by barter, but also with certain goods that served as money. Above all the cacao beans, which functioned as small change, and the cotton mantles, which served as a higher unit of value. Officials oversaw the market, ensuring fair dealing, settling disputes, punishing cheats and thieves, a court sat in the marketplace to judge disputes on the spot. The market was regulated, policed, and ordered, a great engine of commerce running by established rules. The great market of Tlatelolco was, in a sense, the empire made visible. All the abundance and variety of a vast realm, the products of 100 lands and climates, gathered in one place, exchanged among a multitude, in an ordered and bustling display of wealth and industry and commerce. To walk through it, as the astonished Spanish did, was to see the Aztec civilization at the height of its prosperity. Productive, wealthy, sophisticated, ordered, teeming with life and goods. It was one of the great marketplaces of the world in its day, the commercial heart of a mighty empire, and its memory survives in the wondering descriptions of those who saw it, before it, like so much else, was swept away. And underlying all this abundance, the foundation on which the whole teeming wealth of the city rested, was the remarkable system by which the Aztecs fed themselves, the agriculture of the lake, to which we now turn. A great city of 250,000 people, set on an island in a lake, had to be fed, and the Aztecs fed themselves through a remarkable and productive agriculture, centered on the staple crops of Mesoamerica and on the extraordinary farming of the chinampas, the made-up garden plots of the lake. To understand how the Aztec world sustained itself, we must understand its food and its farming. The foundation of the Aztec diet, as of all Mesoamerican civilization, was maize, corn, the great staple grain of the Americas, the gift on which the whole civilization rested. Maize was eaten in countless forms, ground and made into the flat cakes we call tortillas, the daily bread of the Aztec world, made into tamales, dough steamed in wrappings, made into porridges and drinks, the versatile and nourishing foundation of every meal. Maize was so central that it was sacred, associated with gods, surrounded with ritual and reverence, the very stuff of life, the grain that sustained the people. Alongside maize grew the other great staples of Mesoamerican farming, cultivated together in an ancient and ingenious combination. Beans, which grew up the cornstalks and enriched the soil, and squash, which spread along the ground, the three together forming a balanced and sustainable system of agriculture and a nourishing combination in the diet. To these staples the Aztecs added a great variety of other foods. They grew chilies, which flavored their food, tomatoes, a wide range of vegetables and fruits, amaranth, another grain, and many other crops. They harvested the bounty of the lake, fish, waterfowl, frogs, insects and their eggs. Algae skimmed from the water, the rich and varied produce of the watery world around them. They raised a few domesticated animals for meat, turkeys, and a breed of dog, though they had no large livestock, no cattle or sheep or pigs or chickens, none of the great domestic animals of the old world, and so animal protein was scarcer in their diet than plant food, and they had their luxuries and delicacies, above all cacao, the precious chocolate, made into a bitter, frothy, spiced drink that was a luxury of the nobility, prized and costly, the beans valuable enough to serve as money. But the most remarkable feature of Aztec agriculture was the chinampa, the made-up garden plot built up from the lake bed, which we have met already as a means of extending the city, but which was, above all, a system of farming of extraordinary productivity. The chinampas were rectangular plots of made ground, built up in the shallow waters of the lake, separated by canals, their soil constantly renewed and enriched by the fertile mud dredged from the lake bottom, watered naturally by the surrounding lake, capable of producing several crops a year in the mild highland climate. They were among the most productive agricultural systems in the entire pre-modern world. Intensive, sustainable, astonishingly fruitful, worked by hand with simple tools, fed by the inexhaustible mud and water of the lake. The chinampas around and within the city produced an enormous quantity of food, vegetables, flowers, maize and more, helping to feed the great population of the capital, a green and fertile garden world laced with canals where farmers tended their plots from canoes, and the lake itself nourished the crops. Between the chinampas of the lake, the farming of the surrounding land, the tribute in food that flowed in from the conquered provinces, and the bounty harvested from the lake itself, the Aztecs were able to feed their great city and their teeming population, to sustain one of the largest concentrations of people in the world at that time, on an island in a mountain lake. The food system of the Aztecs was a remarkable achievement, the productive foundation on which the whole edifice of their civilization rested, the sacred maize, the ancient trinity of corn and beans and squash, the bounty of the lake, the miraculous fertility of the chinampas, and the tribute of an empire, all flowing together to fill the markets and the storehouses and the bellies of the great city on the water. At the very center of Tenochtitlan, at the heart of the great city on the lake, lay its sacred core, a vast walled precinct filled with temples and shrines, dominated by the towering Great Temple, the religious and symbolic center not only of the city, but of the entire Aztec world. To understand the Aztecs, we must enter this sacred heart of their capital, where the human and the divine met, where the great rituals of their religion were performed, where the cosmos itself was thought to be anchored. The ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan was a great precinct, walled around, at the very middle of the city, where the most important temples and religious buildings stood, a sacred zone set apart from the ordinary city, filled with shrines and temples and the buildings of the priesthood, the focus of the city's religious life. And rising above it all, dominating the precinct and the whole city, was the Great Temple, the Templo Mayor as it is known by its Spanish name, the towering double pyramid that was the supreme sacred structure of the Aztec world. The Great Temple was a massive stepped pyramid, rising in great terraces high above the city, crowned at its summit by twin shrines reached by steep staircases. The two shrines at the top were dedicated to the two greatest gods of the Mexica, one to Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, the patron of the Mexica, the other to Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain and water and fertility, on whom the crops and the life of the people depended. The two shrines, side by side atop the Great Pyramid, the war god and the rain god, the sun and the water, represented the two foundations of Aztec life, conquest and agriculture, and the great temple that bore them was the symbolic center of the Aztec cosmos, the axis where the human world met the divine, the most sacred place in the empire. When archaeologists in modern times excavated the heart of Mexico City, it was the buried base of this great temple that they uncovered, with its rich offerings and its sculptures, bringing the sacred heart of the Aztec world back into the light after centuries beneath the colonial city. Around the great temple, within the sacred precinct, stood many other temples and religious buildings, shrines to other gods, the racks and platforms used in ritual, the schools of the priests, the houses where sacred images and implements were kept, a whole complex of religious architecture. And beyond the sacred precinct spread the rest of the great city, the palaces of the ruler and the nobles, vast and luxurious complexes of many rooms and courtyards and gardens, the houses of the common people, ranging from substantial homes to humble dwellings, the canals and streets and causeways, the markets, the chinampas, the whole teeming expanse of one of the world's great cities. The palaces of the Aztec rulers were especially magnificent, great complexes that housed not only the ruler and his household, but the administration of the empire, with halls of audience and council, courts of justice, storehouses for tribute, workshops for craftsmen, and famous gardens and menageries. For the Aztec rulers kept extensive botanical gardens and zoos, collections of plants and animals and birds gathered from across the empire, a wonder to those who saw them. The royal palace was a city within the city, the seat of imperial power and splendor, displaying the wealth and majesty of the ruler and the empire. All of this, the sacred precinct and its towering temple, the palaces and gardens, the houses and canals and markets, the whole vast and ordered expanse of Tenochtitlan rising from its lake, made up one of the most remarkable cities of the pre-modern world. Beautiful, ordered, wealthy, populous, dominated by the Great Pyramid at its heart, where the gods of sun and rain looked down upon the city of the Mexica. And at the center of it all stood that religion, solemn, grand and demanding, to which we now turn, to understand the gods the Aztecs served and the cosmos they believed they lived in. At the center of the Aztec world stood their religion, a vast, complex and demanding system of belief and ritual, with a great pantheon of gods, an elaborate cosmology, and a solemn vision of the universe and the place of humankind within it. The Aztec religion is among the most striking and, to modernize, the most challenging aspects of their civilization. And to understand the Aztecs, we must try to understand how they saw the cosmos and the gods who ruled it. Let us approach it with the effort to understand, rather than merely to judge. For it was a coherent and deeply held vision of the world, however strange or terrible some of its features may seem to us. The Aztecs worshipped a great many gods, a vast pantheon of deities governing every aspect of the world and of human life. Gods of the sun and moon and stars, of rain and wind and storm, of maize and fertility and the earth, of war and death, of love and flowers and music, of merchants and craftsmen, of the various forces and features of the cosmos. Many of these gods they had inherited from the older civilizations of Mesoamerica, the ancient deities worshipped across the region for centuries. Others were particular to the Mexica. The gods were complex and often ambiguous figures, frequently with multiple aspects and forms, sometimes merging into one another, embodying the forces of a cosmos that the Aztecs saw as charged with sacred power and constant struggle. For the Aztec vision of the cosmos was one of constant struggle, instability, and the need for human participation to maintain the order of the world. The Aztecs believed that the universe was inherently unstable, that the cosmic order was constantly threatened, that the very continuation of the world, the rising of the sun, the coming of the rains, the turning of the seasons, was not guaranteed but had to be sustained through the proper relationship between humans and gods, through ritual, devotion, and offering. The gods had made the world and the sun through their own sacrifice, and humankind, in turn, owed the gods sustenance and offering to keep the cosmos in motion. This sense of a precarious cosmos, dependent on the proper performance of ritual and the maintenance of the sacred order, lay at the heart of Aztec religion and gave it its urgency and its solemnity. The Aztecs were not casual in their religion. They believed that the fate of the world itself was at stake, that the sun might not rise, that the cosmos might collapse into chaos if the gods were not properly served. Among the great multitude of gods, several stood out as supreme, and we will meet them in turn. There was Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, the special patron of the Mexica, who had led them on their migration and who demanded their devotion. There was Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain and water and fertility, on whom the crops depended, one of the oldest and most important gods of all Mesoamerica. There was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the god of wind and wisdom and learning, a culture hero and creator, one of the most important and complex of all the gods. There was Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a powerful, dark and capricious god associated with night, sorcery, fate and rulership, in some ways the most powerful and feared of the gods. And there were many others: the maize gods, the earth goddesses, the god of the dead, the goddess of love and flowers, the gods of pulque and merchants and craftsmen, and countless other domains. The Aztec religion was served by a large and powerful priesthood, a hierarchy of priests, trained in the elite schools, who performed the rituals, kept the calendars, maintained the temples, interpreted the will of the gods, and oversaw the whole vast apparatus of religious life. The priests were figures of great learning and authority, masters of the calendar and the codices, the astronomy and the ritual, the history and the lore of the gods. They led lives of austerity and discipline, performing constant rituals of devotion and penance, and they stood at the center of Aztec life, mediating between the people and the gods, sustaining the precarious order of the cosmos through the unceasing performance of the sacred rites. To understand the Aztec world, we must understand how seriously they took all this, how the maintenance of the cosmos through ritual was, for them, the most important work in the world, the duty on which everything else depended. And to understand that, we must look more closely at their greatest gods and at their vision of the cosmos and its ages, beginning with the patron god of the Mexica themselves, Huitzilopochtli, the special patron and protector of the Mexica. The god who had led them on their long migration, and whom they honored above all others, was Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and of war, a deity particular to the Mexica, who rose with their rise to become one of the supreme gods of the Aztec world. To understand the Mexica and their sense of themselves and their destiny, we must understand Huitzilopochtli, the god at the center of their identity. Huitzilopochtli was, in his essence, a god of the sun and of war, and these two aspects were deeply connected in the Aztec vision, for the daily journey of the sun across the sky was itself imagined as a kind of warfare, a constant struggle, and the sun god was a warrior who battled the forces of darkness. Huitzilopochtli was the young warrior god, associated with the blazing noonday sun, with fire and with battle, depicted as a fierce warrior armed for war. He was the particular god of the Mexica, their tribal deity, the god who had chosen them, led them, and promised them greatness, the divine patron whose worship was bound up with the identity and destiny of the Mexica people. The myth of Huitzilopochtli's birth captured his warlike nature and the cosmic struggle he embodied. According to the legend, his mother, an earth goddess, conceived him miraculously, and his many siblings, the stars and the moon goddess, turned against their mother and sought to kill her, threatened by the coming birth. But at the moment of crisis, Huitzilopochtli was born already fully grown and armed as a warrior, springing forth to defend his mother, and he fought and defeated his siblings, driving off or destroying the stars and casting down the moon goddess. This myth was understood as a cosmic drama. The sun, Huitzilopochtli, rising to drive away the stars, and the moon, his siblings, at dawn. The daily victory of the sun over the powers of night, the eternal struggle of light against darkness, played out each day in the sky, and each day requiring the sun's victory. The birth and battle of Huitzilopochtli was the birth and battle of the sun itself, the cosmic warfare on which the very light of day depended, and this connected to the deepest and most demanding aspect of Mexica religion, the belief that the sun, in its daily struggle, needed sustenance and strength to continue its journey, to win its daily battle against the darkness, to keep rising and keep the world alive, and that this sustenance was owed by humankind to the god. The Mexica believed that they had a special role and duty in the maintenance of the cosmos, to sustain the sun god Huitzilopochtli in his eternal struggle, to provide the offerings that kept the sun moving and the world alive. This belief, that the cosmos depended on human offering, that the sun must be sustained, that the Mexica were the chosen people charged with this cosmic duty, lay at the very heart of their religion and their sense of themselves, and it was bound up with the practice of sacrifice that we will consider shortly, and with the warfare that provided its occasion. Huitzilopochtli, the warrior sun, the patron of the Mexica, the god who must be sustained, was the center of the Mexica religious world, the divine embodiment of their identity, their destiny, and their cosmic mission. As the Mexica rose to power, their god rose with them, until the once obscure tribal deity of a band of wanderers stood among the supreme gods of a mighty empire, honored in the great temple at the heart of the greatest city in the land. Beyond Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec pantheon was rich with great and powerful gods, each governing vast domains of the cosmos and human life, and among them several stood out as supreme, ancient, and profoundly important. Foremost among these were Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, and Tlaloc, the giver of rain. To understand the Aztec religious world, we must come to know these great deities, around whom gathered some of the richest mythology of Mesoamerica. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, whose name combines the quetzal, the bird of brilliant green plumage, with the serpent, was one of the most important, ancient, and complex of all the gods of Mesoamerica, worshipped across the region for many centuries before the Aztecs, associated with the Toltecs whom the Aztecs revered. Quetzalcoatl was a god of many aspects, of the wind, of wisdom, learning, and knowledge, of the arts of civilization, of priesthood, a creator god who had helped make the world and humankind, a culture hero who, in legend, had given humanity many gifts of civilization. He was, in many ways, a benevolent and civilizing deity, associated with knowledge and craft and the good things of culture, contrasted with the darker and more warlike gods. Around Quetzalcoatl gathered a rich and important body of legend, including stories of a great priest-king of the Toltecs who bore the god's name, who ruled in a golden age of culture, who was driven from his kingdom through the trickery of a rival god, and who departed toward the east, promising or prophesied to return one day. This legend of the departed Quetzalcoatl, who would return from the east, would take on a strange and fateful significance at the time of the Spanish conquest, when some would wonder whether the returning strangers might be connected to the prophesied return, though how far this shaped events at the time, and how far it was elaborated afterward, remains debated. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, named for the obsidian mirror associated with him, was in many ways the most powerful, mysterious, and feared of the gods, a dark and capricious deity associated with the night sky, with sorcery and magic, with fate and destiny, with rulership and kingship, with temptation and discord. Tezcatlipoca was an all-powerful, all-seeing god, present everywhere, knowing all things, capable of great gifts and great cruelties, the giver and taker of fortune, the god who tested and tempted humankind, who raised up and cast down kings, who embodied the unpredictable and often harsh workings of fate and power. He was in some ways the supreme god, the most powerful of all, the dark and mighty deity before whom even the other gods gave way, the omnipotent and capricious lord of fate and night. The relationship and rivalry between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl, the dark god of fate and the bright god of wisdom, was one of the great themes of Mesoamerican mythology. Tlaloc, the god of rain, water, and fertility, was one of the most ancient and essential of all the gods, worshipped across Mesoamerica from very early times, on whom the most fundamental needs of life depended: the rain that watered the crops, the water that sustained all living things. Tlaloc was the giver of the life-bringing rains, and also the sender of the destructive storms, floods, drought, and lightning, a powerful and ambivalent deity who could nourish or destroy, on whose favor the harvests and the very survival of the people depended. So important was Tlaloc that one of the two great shrines atop the great temple of Tenochtitlan was dedicated to him, beside that of Huitzilopochtli, the rain god and the war god side by side, the two foundations of Aztec life. Tlaloc was served with great devotion and great fear, for in a civilization wholly dependent on agriculture, the god who controlled the rain controlled the fate of all. Beyond these great gods stretched the vast remainder of the pantheon, the earth goddesses, the maize gods, the goddess of love, beauty and flowers, the god of the dead and the lord of the underworld, the gods of pulque and feasting, the patrons of merchants and craftsmen and every trade, the gods of the wind and fire and the heavens, a whole teeming world of deities governing every force and feature of the cosmos and every aspect of human life. The Aztec religious imagination was vast and rich, peopling the universe with sacred powers, weaving gods into every corner of existence, and all of these gods, and the cosmos they governed, were understood within a grand vision of the ages of the world and the structure of time, the cosmology of the five suns, to which we now turn. The Aztecs, like the other peoples of Mesoamerica, possessed an elaborate and sophisticated vision of cosmic time, a belief that the present world was only the latest in a series of ages or suns, each created and destroyed in turn, and an intricate system of calendars by which they measured and ordered time. This cosmology of the ages and this mastery of the calendar were among the most remarkable achievements of the Aztec mind, and they shaped the whole Aztec sense of the precariousness of the world and the urgency of sustaining it. The Aztecs believed that the world had been created and destroyed several times before the present age, that there had been a succession of suns, or world ages, each presided over by a different sun and a different order, each ending in a great catastrophe that destroyed the world and its inhabitants. According to the most common version of this cosmology, there had been 4 previous suns or ages before the present one. Each age had been an attempt at creation, each had been inhabited by a kind of being, and each had ended in destruction, by wild beasts, by wind, by fire, by flood, in the various accounts, the world made and unmade 4 times over. The present age, the Aztecs believed, was the 5th sun, the 5th and current world age, created after the destruction of the 4th, the age in which they themselves lived, and the creation of this 5th sun, the present world, was bound up with the idea of divine sacrifice. For according to the myth, the present sun was created when the gods gathered in the darkness after the destruction of the previous age, and one of them sacrificed himself, casting himself into a great fire, to become the new sun, and the sun, once created, would not move across the sky until the other gods too gave themselves in sacrifice to set it in motion. The present sun, that is, was born from the self-sacrifice of the gods, and it moved and gave light and life only because the gods had offered themselves for it. This myth established the central principle of Aztec religion, that the cosmos exists through sacrifice, that the sun moves and the world lives only because offering sustains it, and that humankind, in turn, owes the gods sustenance and offering to keep the precious and precarious 5th sun in motion. The world was a gift bought by divine sacrifice, and it had to be maintained by continued offering, or it would end as the 4 previous worlds had ended. And crucially, the Aztecs believed that the 5th sun too was destined to end, that the present world, like its predecessors, would one day be destroyed, in its case by catastrophic earthquakes, when the proper order failed and the cosmos collapsed. The present age was not eternal, but fragile and doomed, sustained only precariously, destined ultimately for destruction. This belief, that they lived in a fragile, borrowed age, the latest in a series of destroyed worlds, sustained only by constant offering and ritual, and destined someday to end in catastrophe, gave the Aztec religion its profound sense of urgency and precariousness, its solemn conviction that the maintenance of the cosmos was a constant and demanding duty on which everything depended. To measure and order time, the Aztecs used an intricate calendar system, in fact 2 interlocking calendars, as did other Mesoamerican peoples. One was a solar calendar of 365 days, dividing the year into 18 months of 20 days each, plus a short unlucky period of 5 days at the end, governing the agricultural year and the cycle of seasonal festivals. The other was a sacred calendar of 260 days, made up of a cycle of 20-day signs combined with numbers, used for divination, for determining the fortunes of days and the destinies of those born on them, for ordering the religious and ritual life, These two calendars ran simultaneously, meshing like interlocking gears, and the combination of the two produced a larger cycle of 52 years, the century of the Aztec world, after which the same combination of dates would recur. The completion of each 52-year cycle was a moment of great cosmic anxiety and ceremony. The new fire ceremony, when the Aztecs feared the world might end, extinguished all their fires, and then, at the critical moment, kindled a new fire to mark the renewal of the cycle and the continuation of the world for another 52 years, a great ritual of cosmic renewal, expressing once more the Aztec sense that the continuation of the world was never guaranteed but had to be ritually secured. This elaborate counting of time, the cycles of days and years, the interlocking calendars, the world ages, and the new fire, reveals the sophistication of Aztec astronomy and mathematics and the depth of their cosmic vision. A civilization that watched the heavens, counted the days with great precision, and believed that the very turning of time and the continuation of the world depended on their vigilance and their offerings. We come now to the aspect of Aztec civilization that is, to modernize, the most difficult and the most disturbing, the practice of human sacrifice, which lay at the center of Aztec religion, and which has dominated, and often distorted, the popular image of the Aztecs ever since. It must be approached with care, neither sensationalized nor excused, but understood, as far as we can, within the religious worldview that gave it meaning. We will treat it soberly, and without dwelling on the grim physical particulars, seeking to understand the belief that lay behind it. We have seen the foundation of the belief, that the cosmos was created and sustained through sacrifice, that the gods had given themselves to create and move the sun, that the present world, the fifth sun, was fragile, borrowed and doomed, sustained only by continued offering, and that humankind owed the gods sustenance to keep the sun moving and the world alive. From this worldview flowed the central and terrible logic of Aztec sacrifice, that human offering was necessary to sustain the cosmos, to feed and strengthen the sun in its daily struggle, to repay the debt owed to the gods who had sacrificed themselves for the world, to keep the precarious fifth sun in motion, and stave off the catastrophe that would otherwise come. Sacrifice, in this vision, was not cruelty for its own sake, but a sacred and necessary duty. The most important work in the world, the maintenance of the cosmos itself, the price of the continuation of all things. Offering and sacrifice took many forms in Aztec religion, from the everyday to the extreme. There were countless offerings of food, flowers, incense, and goods. There was the practice of self-offering, in which priests and devotees offered their own blood in acts of penance and devotion. And there was the sacrifice of human life, performed in the great rituals at the temples, understood as the supreme offering, the feeding of the gods and the sun with the most precious substance, that of human life itself. These rituals were performed by the priesthood, with great solemnity and elaborate ceremony, atop the great pyramids, as the central and most sacred acts of the Aztec religious calendar. We will not dwell on the grim details, which were terrible. What matters for understanding the Aztecs is the meaning the rituals held for them, as sacred duty, cosmic necessity, the sustaining of the world, the repayment of the debt to the gods. The victims of sacrifice were, for the most part, war captives, and this connected sacrifice intimately with warfare, and gave Aztec warfare much of its character and purpose. For the Aztecs, war was not only a means of conquest and tribute, but also a source of the captives required for sacrifice, and the taking of captives, rather than the killing of enemies on the battlefield, was a central aim of Aztec warfare, the path to glory and advancement for the warrior. This linkage of war and sacrifice, war to take captives, captives to feed the gods sustained to keep the world alive, formed a coherent, if, to us, terrible system, in which warfare, religion, and the maintenance of the cosmos were bound tightly together. It also drove the institution of the flower wars, to which we will come. Ritualized warfare conducted in part to obtain captives. We should also understand sacrifice in its political dimension, for it was not only religious, but served the power of the state. The great public rituals, performed atop the towering temples before assembled multitudes, were displays of the power and majesty of the Mexica state and its gods. Awesome, terrifying spectacles that impressed and intimidated subjects and enemies alike, demonstrating the might of the empire and the favor of its gods, binding the populace in shared awe and dread. The scale of sacrifice, and the degree to which it was emphasized, may have grown as the empire grew, and as it served the purposes of state power and intimidation, though the sources here are difficult, colored by the horror of the conquerors who described it, and by the Aztecs' own emphasis on it as a sign of devotion and might. However we weigh the numbers and the motives, human sacrifice was undeniably central to Aztec religion and Aztec life, a practice that flowed, in their understanding, from the deepest logic of their cosmos, the necessity of sustaining the fragile sun and repaying the debt to the gods, and that bound together their religion, their warfare, and their state. It is the aspect of their civilization hardest for us to comprehend, and we can only try to understand the worldview that made it, for them, not monstrous but sacred, while recognizing the genuine horror it held, and the suffering it inflicted, and the way it has shadowed the memory of the Aztecs ever since. War was central to the Aztec world, the means of conquest and tribute, the source of captives for sacrifice, the path to glory and advancement, the very basis of the empire and of the Mexica sense of themselves as a chosen warrior people. And so the warrior held a place of the highest honor in Aztec society, and the military life was woven through the whole fabric of the civilization. To understand the Aztecs, we must understand their way of war and the warriors who waged it. For the Mexica, war was not merely a practical necessity, but a sacred and central vocation, bound up with religion and with the maintenance of the cosmos. The warrior who took captives for sacrifice was performing a religious duty, feeding the gods, sustaining the sun. The path of war was a path of devotion as well as of glory, and it was, above all, the path of advancement. For in Aztec society, a man could rise through military achievement, could win honor, rank, wealth, and privilege through success in war, and especially through the taking of captives. The capture of enemies in battle was the great measure of a warrior's prowess, and the key to his advancement. Far more than the mere killing of foes, a warrior was ranked and honored according to the number of captives he had taken, and could rise to high status and rich reward through his success in capturing enemies for the gods. Aztec boys were trained for war from youth, in the schools, learning the use of weapons and the discipline and courage of the warrior. The weapons of the Aztec warrior were formidable, though made without metal for blades. The chief weapon was a wooden club or sword edged with blades of razor-sharp obsidian, the volcanic glass that could be worked to an edge sharper than steel. There were spears and spear-throwers that hurled darts with great force. There were bows and slings. For defense, warriors carried shields and wore protective garments of quilted cotton, and the elite wore elaborate costumes and insignia marking their rank and their valor. The Aztec army was a great force of disciplined, trained warriors, organized by the Calpulli and the military orders, capable of waging war across great distances and subduing vast territories. The greatest honor belonged to the elite warrior societies, above all the orders of the Eagle warriors and the Jaguar warriors, the most distinguished and feared fighters, who had earned their place through proven valor and the taking of many captives. The Eagle warriors and Jaguar warriors wore magnificent costumes evoking their namesake creatures. The eagle, bird of the sun and the sky, and the jaguar, the great predator of the forests, the most powerful beast of the Mesoamerican world, dressing in feathered eagle costumes or jaguar skins and helmets, embodying the power and ferocity of these sacred animals. To belong to these orders was the height of military honor, the mark of the greatest warriors, who had distinguished themselves above all others in the taking of captives and the deeds of war. The eagle and the jaguar warriors were the elite of the Aztec military, the proven champions, the embodiment of the warrior ideal that stood at the center of Mexica values. Success in war brought not only honor and rank but tangible rewards: land, tribute, privileges, the right to wear certain insignia and ornaments, advancement in society, so that the warrior's path was the great avenue of ambition and achievement in the Aztec world. Even commoners could rise through military valor, winning honors and advancement that lifted them above their birth, so that war was a ladder of social mobility as well as a sacred duty and a source of glory. The whole society was, in a sense, organized for war. Its values, its religion, its education, its system of honor and advancement, all oriented toward the warrior ideal, the taking of captives, the expansion of the empire, the feeding of the gods. The Mexica saw themselves as a chosen warrior people, charged by their god with a cosmic mission of conquest and sacrifice. And the warrior, the eagle, the jaguar, the taker of captives, stood at the very center of their world, honored above almost all others, the embodiment of the values and the destiny of the Aztec state. Among the most distinctive and curious of Aztec institutions was the practice of the so-called flower wars, a form of ritualized, prearranged warfare conducted between the Aztecs and certain neighboring states, fought according to particular conventions and serving purposes different from those of ordinary war. The Flower Wars are a window into the peculiar character of Aztec warfare and its deep entanglement with religion and the taking of captives. Ordinary Aztec warfare aimed at conquest and tribute, the subjugation of enemy states and their incorporation into the tribute network of the empire. But the Flower Wars were something different. Arranged battles, fought by mutual agreement between the Aztecs and certain rival states, most famously the independent state of Tlaxcala, which the Aztecs never conquered, and which remained a hostile enclave within the region, conducted not primarily for conquest of territory, but for other purposes, and especially, it is generally understood, for the taking of captives for sacrifice, and for the training and proving of warriors. These were, in a sense, ceremonial wars, fought according to conventions, between enemies who agreed to meet in battle for purposes that went beyond simple conquest. The exact purposes and nature of the Flower Wars have been much debated, for they are puzzling to modern understanding. The most common explanation is that they served to obtain captives for sacrifice in a controlled and reliable way, providing a steady supply of the war captives the religion required through arranged battles with nearby enemies, rather than relying solely on the captives of distant campaigns of conquest. They may also have served to train and blood young warriors, to provide opportunities for warriors to demonstrate valor and win advancement, to keep the military sharp, and to exert ongoing pressure on rival states that the Aztecs had not been able or willing to conquer outright. Some scholars have suggested they were also a form of prolonged, ritualized struggle for dominance with rivals like Tlaxcala, a way of continually demonstrating Aztec superiority and wearing down enemies over time. Whatever the precise mix of motives, the Flower Wars were a distinctive feature of the Aztec world, embodying the deep connection between warfare, religion, and the taking of captives that characterized Mexican civilization. The Flower Wars also reveal something important about the limits of Aztec power and the tensions within their world. For the existence of unconquered, hostile states like Tlaxcala, right within the heart of the region, against whom the Aztecs waged these ritual wars, but whom they never subdued, points to the incompleteness of Aztec domination and to the depth of the enmities the empire had created. Tlaxcala, in particular, was a fiercely independent state that hated the Aztecs, that had resisted all attempts at conquest, and that maintained its independence as a hostile island within the Aztec world. And this enmity, this unconquered hatred on the empire's doorstep, would prove momentous, for when the Spanish came, it was the Tlaxcalans who would become their crucial allies against the Aztecs, providing the vast native army without which the conquest could never have succeeded. The Flower Wars, in this light, were part of a long, unresolved struggle that left bitter enemies unconquered at the heart of the Aztec world, enemies who would, in the end, help to bring the empire down. For all the emphasis on war and sacrifice, the Aztec world was also a world of great refinement, beauty, and learning, of magnificent art and craftsmanship, of poetry and music, of writing and knowledge. The Aztecs were heirs to the ancient artistic and intellectual traditions of Mesoamerica, and they were themselves accomplished artists, craftsmen, poets, and scholars. To see only the war and the sacrifice is to miss half of their civilization. They were also makers of beauty and seekers of wisdom, and we should give due attention to the arts and the learning of the Aztec world. The Aztecs were skilled in many arts and crafts, producing works of great beauty and sophistication. They were masters of sculpture, carving in stone both colossal monuments and intricate small works, images of gods, ritual objects, calendar stones, and naturalistic depictions of animals and plants and people, ranging from the awesome and terrible to the delicate and lifelike. They were fine potters, weavers, and workers of many materials. They were renowned, above all, for two luxury arts that the Mesoamerican world prized especially: featherwork and goldwork. The featherworkers created dazzling objects from the brilliant plumage of tropical birds, headdresses, shields, garments, and ornaments of shimmering, iridescent feathers, especially the precious green plumes of the quetzal, works of extraordinary beauty that were among the most valued treasures of the Aztec world. The goldsmiths and workers of precious materials created fine jewelry and ornaments of gold, jade, turquoise, and other precious substances, objects of great craftsmanship and beauty. Much of the goldwork, tragically, would later be melted down by the Spanish for its raw value, destroying countless masterpieces, but the accounts of those who saw them, and the few surviving pieces, attest to their extraordinary quality. The Aztecs also had a rich tradition of writing and record-keeping, in their system of pictorial and symbolic writing recorded in the painted codices. As we have seen, this writing combined pictures, symbols, and signs to record names, dates, places, events, calendars, genealogies, tribute, and religious and historical knowledge, working together with trained memory. The scribes and priests who mastered this writing were keepers of knowledge and history, and the codices were the libraries and archives of the Aztec world. Though most were destroyed in the conquest, the system represented a sophisticated means of recording and transmitting knowledge, and the surviving and post-conquest codices are among our most precious windows into the Aztec world. And the Aztecs had a rich tradition of oral literature, poetry, and fine speech, for they valued eloquence and the beautiful use of language very highly, and cultivated a refined art of formal, metaphor-rich oratory and poetry. They composed and performed poetry on themes of war and glory, of the gods and the cosmos, and, strikingly, of the beauty and brevity and sorrow of life, the fleeting nature of existence, the transience of all things, the nearness of death. Some of this poetry, preserved in post-conquest collections, is of great beauty and philosophical depth, meditating on the fleeting quality of life, the inevitability of death, the fragile beauty of the world. Flower and song, as the Aztecs called poetry, the beautiful and transient expressions of the human spirit. One of the most famous figures associated with this poetic and philosophical tradition was a ruler of Texcoco, the allied city renowned as a center of culture, learning, and the arts. Remembered as a poet, sage, lawgiver, and patron of civilization, a figure who embodied the refined and intellectual side of the Aztec world. This poetry of flower and song, with its meditations on the transience and beauty of life, reveals a depth of reflection and sensibility in the Aztec world that balances and complicates the image of a civilization of war and sacrifice, a people who could contemplate, with great beauty and poignancy, the fleeting and precious nature of human existence. Beyond the temples and the battlefields, the palaces and the markets, the Aztec world was made up of the daily lives of ordinary people, the farmers and craftsmen and laborers and their families, who lived and worked in the city and the countryside, whose existence followed the rhythms of work and worship, family and festival, that filled the days of the common people. To complete our picture of the Aztec world, we should look at the texture of ordinary daily life, the homes, the food, the clothing, the work, the rhythm of existence for the common people of the empire. The homes of ordinary Aztecs were modest dwellings, typically of one or a few rooms, built of adobe, sun-dried mud brick, or of wattle and daub, with thatched or flat roofs, often arranged around a small courtyard, sometimes raised on platforms above the damp ground of the lake city. A typical household might include an extended family, with the dwelling, a small garden or chintampa plot, and the simple furnishings of daily life: sleeping mats, hearths, grinding stones for maize, pottery vessels, baskets, the tools of work. The houses of the nobility were grander, larger, finer, more luxurious. But the common people lived simply, in modest homes, by the standards of their world. The daily food of the common people centered, as we have seen, on maize, the tortillas and tamales and maize porridges that were the foundation of every meal, supplemented with beans, squash, chilies, vegetables, the produce of the chinampas and gardens, the fish and waterfowl and other bounty of the lake, and occasional meat. The day began early, with the women rising before dawn to begin the long labor of grinding the maize and preparing the tortillas, the staple labor of the household. Meals were simple and largely vegetarian, eaten through the day. Pulque, a mildly alcoholic drink made from the maguey plant, was consumed, though drunkenness was strictly frowned upon and punished, especially among the young. Chocolate, the luxury drink, was reserved largely for the nobility and the wealthy. The clothing of the Aztecs was governed by strict rules of rank and status, for dress was an important marker of one's place in the rigidly ordered society. The basic garments were simple. For men, a loincloth and a cloak or mantle knotted at the shoulder. For women, a skirt and a sleeveless tunic, woven of maguey fiber for the common people, of finer cotton for those of higher rank. But the quality of the cloth, the decoration, the ornaments, the right to wear certain colors, garments, and adornments, were strictly regulated according to rank and achievement, so that a person's dress proclaimed their status. Sumptuary laws reserved the finest garments, the cotton, the ornaments, the feathers and jewels, for the nobility and the proven warriors, while commoners were restricted to plain garments of coarser fiber. Dress was a visible language of rank, achievement, and status in the ordered Aztec world. The rhythm of life was shaped by work, by the family and community of the Calpulli, and by the constant round of religious festivals that marked the calendar. The Aztec year was punctuated by frequent festivals, tied to the months of the solar calendar, and to the agricultural and religious cycles, great public ceremonies and celebrations, with processions, music, dancing, feasting, offerings and ritual, in which the whole community took part. These festivals broke the routine of labor, bound the community together, honored the gods, and marked the turning of the seasons and the year. Between the festivals ran the daily round of work, farming the chinampas and fields, fishing the lake, plying the crafts and trades, the women's endless labor of grinding maize and weaving cloth and keeping the household, the men's work of farming and fishing and craft and, when called, of war. It was a life of work and discipline and devotion, ordered by strict custom and law, bound by family and community and religion, lived in the shadow of the great temples and under the rule of the nobility and the Taloanai, the daily existence of the common people who made up the great mass of the Aztec world, and on whose labor the whole magnificent edifice of the empire rested. The women of the Aztec world played essential roles in the life of the civilization, and though theirs was a society in which men held the public offices of rule, war, and priesthood, women had their own important spheres, duties, rights, and dignities. To complete our picture of Aztec society, we should consider the place and the lives of its women. The central sphere of women's life was the household, and the labor of the home was women's domain and women's enormous contribution to the life of the society. The work of feeding the family was unceasing and arduous, centered on the grinding of maize and the making of tortillas, a labor that consumed many hours of every day, beginning before dawn, the fundamental and endless task on which the nourishment of the household depended. Women also wove the cloth that clothed the family and that served as tribute and currency, spinning and weaving being central women's skills. The production of textiles a major part of women's work and of the economy. Women kept the household, raised the young children, prepared the food, made the cloth, and managed the domestic economy, labor essential to the survival and functioning of the society, honored and valued, even if it did not bring public office or status. Women's roles extended beyond the household in various ways. There were women who worked as healers, midwives, and practitioners of the arts of medicine and childbirth, holding important and respected roles in the care of health and the bringing of new life. There were priestesses and women with religious roles, serving certain deities and performing certain rituals, for the religious life was not wholly closed to women. There were women who engaged in trade and commerce, in the markets and as vendors. There were skilled craftswomen. Women could own and inherit property, could engage in commerce, had legal rights and standing, and were not without power and dignity in their world, even within its patriarchal structure. Marriage and motherhood were central to women's lives and were surrounded with honor and meaning. Marriage was an important and ceremonious institution, and the wife and mother held an honored place at the heart of the family. Motherhood was especially honored, and strikingly, the Aztecs accorded a special honor to women who died in childbirth, regarding them as the equivalent of warriors who died in battle or sacrifice, for they too had struggled and given their lives in a kind of battle, the bringing forth of new life. Such women were believed to attain a special honored afterlife, like that of fallen warriors. This remarkable belief, equating the woman who died bringing forth life with the warrior who died taking it, reveals the high honor the Aztecs accorded to the female struggle of childbirth, placing it on a par with the male struggle of war, as a giving of life and death in the service of the people and the cosmos. The lives of Aztec women, then, were lives of essential labor, of honored domestic and economic roles, of religious and healing functions, of marriage and motherhood, lived within a society that, while patriarchal in its public structures of rule and war and priesthood, accorded women their own spheres, rights, dignities and honors, from the empress and the noble women to the common wives and mothers grinding maize before dawn. The women of the Aztec world sustained the households and the families and much of the economy on which the whole civilization depended, an essential and honored half of the Aztec world, without whom the great edifice of the empire could not have stood. And over all of this society, the nobles and commoners, the warriors and priests, the men and women, the whole ordered world we have surveyed, ruled the line of emperors, the Tlaloc of Tenochtitlan, to whom we now turn as we move toward the height of the empire and the gathering of its doom. Picture a long, narrow court sunk between two high stone walls, its shape like a great capital letter laid open to the sky. This is the Tlachtli, the ball court, and across all the lands of Mesoamerica there was no place quite like it. The Aztecs did not invent the game played here. They inherited it, as they inherited so much, from the peoples who had come before. A contest older than memory, older than the city, older than the very idea of an empire on the lake. For more than 1,000 years before the Mexica raised their temples, men had been striking a heavy ball of rubber across courts much like this one, and the game carried with it a weight far deeper than sport. The very rubber of the ball, the shape of the court, the rules and the rituals that surrounded the play, all had been handed down across the long centuries, from people to people, kingdom to kingdom, so that when an Aztec lord watched the ball leap and fly between the high stone walls, he was watching something his distant ancestors had watched in just the same way, an unbroken thread of play and meaning running back into the deep darkness of the past. The ball itself was a marvel to those who had never seen it. It was made of uli, the milky sap of rubber trees that grew in the hot lowlands far to the east, gathered and worked until it became a solid sphere, dense and dark and astonishingly alive. When it struck the stone floor, it leapt back as if it held a spirit of its own, and the Spaniards who later watched the game could scarcely believe their eyes, for they had never beheld a material that bounced. The ball was heavy, heavy enough to break bone, heavy enough to kill a careless player struck in the throat or the temple, and the men who played learned to meet it not with their hands nor their feet, but with their hips and thighs and the hard padding strapped across their bodies. To watch the game was to watch something close to war made beautiful. The players hurled themselves against the stone, twisting their whole weight to send the heavy ball flying along the alley of the court, each side striving to keep it in motion, to drive it past their opponents, to win the point. In some versions, set high on the walls above the players, hung rings of carved stone, their openings barely wider than the ball itself. And to pass the ball clean through one of these rings was so rare, so nearly impossible, that a single such stroke could end the contest in an instant and crown the one who achieved it with sudden glory. Most games were not decided this way. Most were long, bruising affairs of points and counters, of bodies thrown and recovered, of the dull, heavy knock of rubber on stone echoing between the walls. Yet beneath the sweat and the wagering lay something sacred. To the Mesoamerican mind, the court was a model of the cosmos, and the ball in its restless arc was the sun, or the moon, or the wandering lights of the heavens, kept in motion by the struggle of the players as the gods kept the sky in motion through their own unending labor. The game was a reenactment of the great contest between light and darkness, day and night, the forces that ruled the turning of the world. To play was, in a quiet way, to take part in holding up the heavens. Around the court the wagers ran high. Men staked jade and gold, cloaks of fine cotton, loads of cacao beans, the feathers of rare birds, and the stories tell of those who, having lost everything else, staked their own freedom on a single game and walked away as slaves. Nobles and commoners alike were caught in the fever of it. Kings kept their own courts and their own players, and a great match could draw crowds who pressed against the walls and roared with each strike of the ball, their breath rising in the thin mountain air. So the game endured, a thread running back through all the ages of this land, binding the Aztecs to the Maya and the Olmec and all the forgotten players before them. A contest of muscle and stone that was also a prayer, a ritual of the moving sun, played out again and again beneath the wide and watching sky. There were courts in nearly every city of consequence, and the greatest of them lay within the sacred precinct of the capital itself, hard beneath the shadow of the towering temple, so that the play of the ball and the worship of the gods stood side by side at the very heart of the city. The skulls of the court, the rings, the carved stone markers set into its walls, all spoke the same silent language, reminding every player and every watcher that this was no idle pastime, but a small turning of the same great wheel that moved the sun across the sky and the seasons across the land. When a game ended and the crowds drifted home along the canals in the failing light, the heavy ball was carried away with care, and the court fell silent, waiting, as the courts had waited for 1,000 years, for the next contest of the moving sun. There is a kind of beauty that lives only in the patience of skilled hands, and in Tenochtitlan such hands were everywhere. The Aztecs prized the work of their craftsmen above almost all things, and held certain makers in such honor that they were thought to be touched by the gods. Chief among these were the Amanteca, the feather workers, whose art has few equals anywhere in the history of the world, and whose finest pieces could stop the breath of any who beheld them. Consider what they worked with. From the steaming forests far to the south came the feathers of the quetzal, that shy and brilliant bird whose tail plumes shimmer with a green so deep it seems lit from within, longer than a man's arm and worth, to the Aztec eye, more than gold. There came the scarlet of the macaw, the turquoise and rose of the cotinga, the iridescent throats of hummingbirds caught like fragments of fallen light. The feather workers gathered these treasures and bound them, feather by tiny feather, onto frameworks of reed and cotton and fine-beaten bark, building up images of gods and beasts and flowering vines in a mosaic of living color. A great feather shield, a headdress fit for a king, a cloak that rippled like a field of jewels when its wearer moved. These were the masterworks of an art so delicate that almost none of it survived the centuries, for feathers fade and crumble where stone and gold endure. Beside the feather workers labored the goldsmiths, and their skill too was a wonder. They knew the secret of casting by the lost wax method, shaping their designs first in wax over a core of clay and charcoal, then encasing the whole in clay and melting the wax away, pouring molten gold into the hollow it left behind. From this came pendants and bells, lip plugs and ear spools, figures of frogs and turtles, and gods so finely made that the Spaniards who later melted them down for bullion confessed, even as they destroyed them, that they had never seen finer work in all of Europe. And there were the lapidaries, the workers of stone, who ground and polished jade until it glowed like green water, who cut turquoise into 1,000 small tiles and set them into masks and shields and the hilts of sacred knives, who shaped obsidian, that black volcanic glass born of the fire of the earth, into blades keener than any metal, and into mirrors dark and polished in which a man might glimpse, the priest said, the smoking face of a god. It is worth pausing on what the Aztecs counted as treasure, for it was not as we might count it. Gold they valued, yes, and called it the excrement of the gods, a thing precious but earthly. Above gold they set jade, that cool green stone of water and life and growth, and above all they set the feathers of the quetzal, things of pure colour and air, weightless and impossibly rare, the very emblem of the precious and the fleeting. A man wealthy in feathers and jade was wealthy indeed, and the markets where these things changed hands were watched over by their own gods and guarded by their own laws. All of this skill was passed down within families and within the Kalpuli, the neighborhood guilds, from father to son, from mother to daughter, generation upon generation, each maker adding their small portion to a river of craft that ran back into the deep past. The work was slow. A single great piece might take a season or a year, but the makers were in no hurry, for to them the labor itself was a form of devotion, a way of offering up the best of human skill to the gods who had given them their hands. And there were the scribes and the painters, whose hands kept the memory of the whole people, with brushes of fur and feather, and with inks and paints ground from minerals and plants and the bodies of small insects. They laid down upon long folded screens of bark paper and deerskin the signs and images that held the history, the calendars, the genealogies, and the sacred knowledge of the Aztec world. To be a painter of books was to be a keeper of memory, and the work demanded not only a steady hand but a trained and capacious mind, for the painted signs were prompts and anchors for a knowledge that lived also in the reciter's memory. In the bright workshops of the city, then, beauty and knowledge were made together, feather by feather and line by line, by the patient hands of makers who knew themselves to be servants of something far older and larger than their single lives. Of all the wonders of Tenochtitlan, few astonished its visitors more than the gardens, and the strange truth is that the lords of the Aztecs kept gardens not for food, that came from the Chinampas and the tribute lands, but purely for beauty, for study, and for delight. This alone set them apart, for in much of the world of that age such gardens were unknown, and the Spaniards who walked among them found themselves at a loss for words. The greatest of these lay at Hoaxtep, in the warm lands south of the valley, where a king had ordered plants brought from every corner of the empire and settled into the earth beside flowing springs. Gardeners carried whole trees wrapped in matting along the mountain roads. They brought flowers and healing herbs and fragrant shrubs from the hot coasts and the cool highlands alike, and planted them in long-ordered beds threaded with water channels. It was, in all but name, a botanical garden, gathered for the love of growing things and for the knowledge the healers might draw from them, a place where the variety of a whole land was held in one green and blooming bowl. Within the city itself, in the palace of the great emperor, were wonders of another kind. There was a house of birds so vast that it took many keepers to tend it, where birds of every feather the empire could offer were kept in courts and cages, and upon ponds of fresh and salt water built for the kinds that needed each. Here lived the waterfowl of the lakes and the bright parrots of the south, the herons and the eagles, and the small jeweled hummingbirds, and the keepers gathered the feathers that molted naturally from these living birds to pass to the feather workers, so that beauty fed beauty in an endless round. There was also a house of beasts, which we might call a menagerie, where jaguars paced in their pens, and pumas watched with yellow eyes, where coyotes and wolves and foxes were kept, and serpents of many kinds coiled in great jars of feathers and earth. There were even, the chronicles say, rooms set aside for people born with unusual forms, kept and cared for as part of the emperor's vast living collection of the world's strangeness. To walk through these halls was to feel that the lord of the city held, within his own walls, a small mirror of all creation, and beyond the made gardens lay the living world of the valley itself, which was garden enough. The lakes teemed with life, flocks of waterbirds that rose in clouds at dawn, fish silvering the shallows, and the axolotl, that strange smiling salamander that never grows beyond its youthful shape, hiding in the reeds. Even the green scum that gathered on the water, the spirulina algae the people called teculatl, was skimmed and dried into cakes and eaten, a food drawn straight from the surface of the lake. Frogs and insects, the eggs of waterflies, the tender shoots of reeds, the valley gave freely to those who knew how to gather. And over all of it, on the eastern rim of the world, stood the two great volcanoes, Popocatépetl, the smoking mountain, with his plume of vapor rising into the cold blue, and beside him Iztaccíhuatl, the white woman, her snowy ridges lying still against the sky like a sleeping form. The people told tender stories of these two, a warrior and his beloved, turned to stone and snow, watching over the valley forever. Morning after morning their white heads caught the first gold of the sun, while the city below still lay in shadow, and the smoke of Popocatépetl drifted on the high winds, a slow and patient breath at the edge of the Aztec world. These gardens and collections were more than the indulgence of kings. They were, in their way, an expression of how the Aztecs saw the world, as a vast and wondrous abundance to be gathered, ordered, studied, and honored. The same impulse that sent the merchants to the edges of the known world, that filled the great market with the produce of 100 lands, that bound the feathers of distant birds into images of the gods, gathered also the living plants and creatures of the empire into these green courts and shaded halls. To stand in the emperor's garden, among flowers brought from 1,000 miles away, listening to the cries of birds from forests one would never see, was to feel the reach and the richness of the Aztec world, made small enough to walk through in an afternoon. A whole empire of growing and living things, gathered and tended at the heart of the city on the lake. The year of the Aztecs turned like a great slow wheel, divided into 18 months of 20 days each, with a handful of nameless days left over at the close, and at the heart of nearly every month stood a festival, so that the rhythm of life was a rhythm of gatherings, of music and dance and procession that bound the whole people together in the passage of time. To understand these festivals you must first hear the instruments, for the Aztecs were a people who loved sound. There was the huhil, the tall upright drum, hollowed from a single log and headed with taut hide, struck with the bare hands to send a deep heartbeat rolling across the plazas. There was the tepenatzli, a drum laid on its side, carved from a log with tongues of wood cut into its upper face, each tongue tuned to its own note, so that the player, striking with rubber-tipped beaters, could draw a melody of warm, hollow tones from the wood. There were conch shell trumpets that moaned long and low across the water, clay flutes pierced to sing in clear, high voices, whistles shaped like birds, and rattles and bells of clay and copper and shell that hissed and chimed with every movement of the dancers. And there was song. The Aztecs called their poetry in Xochitl in Cucatal, the flower and the song, and they treasured it as among the finest of all human things. In special houses called the Cucacali, the houses of song, the young were taught the great chants and the dances that went with them, and on festival days the singers would gather and lift their voices together while the drums spoke beneath them and the dancers moved in long circling lines, their bodies bright with feathers and paint, their ankles ringed with rattling shells. Each festival had its own character, woven around the gods and the seasons. There were months given to the rain god Tlaloc, when the people prayed for the coming of the waters that would swell the maize. There were months given to the renewal of the earth, when the husk of the old year was shed and the new green called forth. There were harvest festivals heavy with the smell of fresh maize and the smoke of copal incense, and festivals of the warriors, and festivals when the whole city feasted and gave gifts and the boundaries between the high and the low softened for a day. Some of these gatherings carried, at their solemn center, the offerings of blood that the Aztecs believed the gods required, and these the people approached with gravity, as a sacred duty rather than a spectacle, a debt owed to the powers that held the world together. But the larger truth of the festivals was joy. They were the bright punctuation of a working year, the days the farmer in his chintampa, and the woman at her loom, and the merchant on the road all looked toward. They were color poured into the streets, the deep pulse of the Huhuetl felt in the chest, the long lines of dancers turning beneath banners of feathers, the voices of the singers rising into the mountain air. Through them the people marked the wheeling of the heavens and the ripening of the fields, and felt themselves part of something far larger than any single life. The great turning year, the breath of the gods, the endless round of the world renewing itself season upon season. And when a festival ended at last, when the drums fell quiet and the dancers unbound the rattles from their ankles and the singers let their voices rest, the people carried something of it home with them into the ordinary days that followed. A memory of colour and sound, a renewed sense of their place in the wheeling order of things, a quiet assurance that the world had been honoured and would turn again toward the next gathering. So the year moved on, festival to festival, season to season, the great wheel turning, the drums waiting in the houses of song for the day they would speak again. It was a calendar not of empty squares, but of bright recurring joys, and it gave to every life, however humble, a share in the grand and patient rhythm of the Aztec world. The Aztec Empire was built and ruled by a line of able and ambitious kings, the Tlatoc, the supreme rulers of Tenochtitlan, who over the course of about a century transformed the Mexica from a subject people into the masters of an empire. To understand the rise of the empire to its height, we should follow this line of rulers, the great kings whose conquests and statecraft built the Aztec power. The first Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan was chosen, according to tradition, not long after the founding of the city, when the Mexica, still a subject people, sought to give themselves a ruler of legitimate and prestigious lineage, and they chose a king connected to the prestigious royal lines of the valley, and especially to the revered Toltec heritage, to give their ruler and their people the legitimacy and standing they craved. From this first ruler descended the line of Aztec kings, each chosen from the royal family by the council of nobles, each adding, in his reign, to the power and territory and splendor of the Mexica state. The early rulers consolidated the position of the Mexica, strengthened their city, and began the rise toward independence and power, still largely within the shadow of more powerful overlords. The decisive transformation came, as we have seen, with the overthrow of the dominant power of the valley and the formation of the Triple Alliance in the early 15th century, and the ruler under whom this great turning came, and his brilliant chief advisor, reorganized and strengthened the Mexica state, reformed its institutions, and set it on the path of imperial expansion. Under this ruler and his successors, the Mexica moved from being subjects to being masters, from a city-state to the heart of an empire. The reforms of this period, strengthening the monarchy, reorganizing the society and the army, cultivating the ideology of the Mexica as a chosen warrior people with a cosmic mission, laid the foundations of the imperial greatness to come. The kings who followed pursued a vigorous and sustained policy of conquest, extending the power of the Triple Alliance ever farther across the lands of central and southern Mexico, subduing region after region, drawing an ever wider world into the net of tribute and domination. Each reign added new conquests, new tributary provinces, new wealth flowing into Tenochtitlan. Each king sought to prove himself a great warrior and conqueror, to expand the empire and to feed the gods with captives, to add to the glory and power of the Mexica. The empire grew through a combination of military conquest, intimidation, alliance, and the relentless extension of the tribute system, until it stretched across a vast territory, encompassing many millions of people in hundreds of subject communities, all paying tribute to the great city on the lake. The reigns of these kings also saw the growth and beautification of Tenochtitlan itself, the rebuilding and enlargement of the great temple, raised higher and grander by successive rulers, the building of palaces, aqueducts, causeways, and public works, the adornment of the city with the wealth and art and tribute of the empire. Each ruler sought to add to the magnificence of the capital, to leave his mark in stone and splendor, to make Tenochtitlan ever more worthy of its place as the heart of the empire. By the late 15th century, under a series of able and conquering kings, the Aztec Empire had risen to be the dominant power of Mesoamerica, its capital one of the greatest cities in the world, its tribute network spanning a vast realm, its armies feared across the land, its gods honored in the towering temples of a magnificent city. The despised wanderers had become the masters of an empire, and the empire was approaching the height of its power and glory. Two rulers in particular carried it to that height, and we turn to them now. By the late 15th century, the Aztec Empire reached the height of its power, wealth, and extent, under a series of vigorous and conquering rulers who pushed its boundaries ever farther and filled its capital with ever greater splendor. This was the golden age of Aztec power, the empire at its mightiest, the city at its most magnificent, the Mexica at the summit of their long rise from obscurity to dominance. Let us survey the empire at its height, before the shadow of its doom began to fall. Under the great conquering kings of this period, the empire expanded enormously, its armies marching far and wide to subdue new lands and peoples, extending the tribute network across central and southern Mexico, from coast to coast, encompassing a vast and varied realm of many climates and peoples. One ruler in particular was remembered as a great conqueror and consolidator, who extended the empire widely and strengthened its institutions, and his successors pushed the conquests still farther, until the empire reached its greatest extent, a domain of hundreds of subject communities and millions of people, all drawn into the orbit of the Triple Alliance and the tribute of Tenochtitlan. The empire at its height was the greatest power Mesoamerica had ever seen, dominant across a vast territory, its hegemony extending over a large part of what is now Mexico, and the wealth of this vast empire flowed into Tenochtitlan, making it a city of extraordinary splendor and abundance, the tribute of hundreds of provinces, the food, the cloth, the gold and jade and turquoise and feathers, the luxury goods and raw materials of 100 lands poured into the capital, filling its storehouses, adorning its nobility, funding its temples and palaces and public works. The city grew to a great size. By the time of its height, perhaps the largest city in the Americas, and one of the largest in the world, home to 250,000 people or more, a teeming metropolis of temples and palaces and markets and canals, beautiful and ordered and rich, the magnificent heart of a mighty empire. When the Spanish first beheld it, they were astonished, declaring it more beautiful and more impressive than the cities of Europe, a wonder beyond anything they had imagined. A great city floating in splendor upon its lake, the empire at its height was a formidable and sophisticated state, with its powerful military, its vast tribute economy, its elaborate social and political order, its great religious institutions, its accomplished arts and learning, its magnificent capital. It dominated Mesoamerica. It had no rival in power. Its armies were feared. Its wealth was vast. Its gods were honored in towering temples. Its emperor ruled in majesty over a great realm. The Mexica had achieved, it seemed, the destiny their god had promised them on their long migration. They had become a great people, rulers of an empire, masters of the valley and far beyond. To an observer at the close of the 15th century, the Aztec Empire must have seemed mighty and secure, at the very summit of its power, with no obvious threat to its dominance, destined to endure and to grow. And yet, beneath the splendor and the power, there were weaknesses and tensions that would prove fatal when the moment of crisis came. The empire ruled largely through fear and tribute rather than loyalty and integration, and its subject peoples, groaning under the burden of tribute and the demand for sacrificial victims, hated and feared their Mexica overlords and longed to be free of them. Unconquered enemies, like the fiercely independent Tlaxcalans, remained hostile within the heart of the region, nursing their enmity. The empire was a structure of domination held together by force, riddled with resentment, surrounded and infiltrated by enemies who waited only for a chance to strike. These hidden weaknesses were invisible in the days of glory, when the empire stood at its height and no challenger appeared, but they were real. And when the unimaginable challenge came, from across the sea, they would bring the whole mighty edifice down with astonishing speed. The empire was at its zenith, and the strangers were already on their way. But before they came, the final great emperor would ascend the throne, and strange omens would begin to trouble the Aztec world. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the Aztec Empire stood at its height under its last great emperor. And yet, in the memory of the Aztecs as it was recorded after the conquest, these final years were troubled by a series of strange and ominous portents, signs and wonders that seemed, in retrospect, to foretell the catastrophe that was coming. We must consider both the last great emperor and these famous omens, though with care, for the omens come to us coloured by hindsight, shaped by the knowledge of what was to follow. The last great emperor of the independent Aztec Empire was Moctezuma II, often called Montezuma, who came to the throne in the early years of the 16th century, around the year 1502, and who would be ruling when the Spanish came. Moctezuma was a proud and able ruler, a successful warrior and conqueror who extended and consolidated the empire, and a deeply religious and somewhat austere figure, much concerned with the proper observance of religion and the dignity of his office. Under him the empire continued at its height, powerful and dominant, He ruled in great majesty, surrounded by elaborate ceremony and the awe due to a semi-divine monarch, the supreme lord of the greatest empire in the land. He was, by all accounts, an intelligent and capable ruler, but also, perhaps, a man inclined to brooding, to religious anxiety, to a concern with omens and the will of the gods, qualities that would shape his fateful response to the crisis that was coming. For in the years before the Spanish came, the Aztec world was troubled, so the later accounts tell us, by a series of alarming omens and portents, strange signs that seemed to forebode disaster. There was said to have appeared a great comet or fiery light in the sky, blazing like a tongue of flame, an evil portent. There were said to have been strange fires, the burning of a temple by inexplicable flames, the striking of another by lightning. There were reports of strange voices heard weeping in the night, of monstrous omens and apparitions, of the waters of the lake rising and boiling without cause, of strange creatures and unnatural signs. These portents, the accounts say, troubled and frightened Moctezuma and his people, seeming to foretell some great calamity, some overturning of the world, though its nature was unknown. How much weight to give these omens is difficult to judge, for they come to us almost entirely through accounts written after the conquest, shaped by the knowledge of the catastrophe that followed, and very likely elaborated, reshaped, or even invented in hindsight to make sense of the disaster, to give it the shape of a foretold doom. It is a deeply human tendency, after a catastrophe, to remember the warning signs, to see in retrospect the omens that foretold it, to weave the disaster into a pattern of prophecy and fate, and the Aztec accounts of the omens preceding the conquest surely owe much to this tendency. Whether the Aztecs truly were troubled by such portents before the Spanish came, or whether the omens were largely the creation of hindsight, we cannot be sure. But the omens became part of the story the Aztecs told of their fall, a sense that the catastrophe had been foreshadowed, that the gods had sent warnings, that the overturning of their world had been written in the heavens, and the strange signs of those final years. And bound up with this, in some accounts, was the legend of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, or the priest-king who bore his name, who in legend had departed toward the east long ago, with a promise or prophecy of return. Some later accounts suggest that the Aztecs, or Moctezuma himself, may have wondered whether the strangers arriving from the east, across the sea, might be connected to the returning Quetzalcoatl or his emissaries, whether the prophecy was being fulfilled, whether gods or their agents were returning. How far this idea truly influenced Moctezuma and the Aztecs at the time, and how far it was elaborated afterward to explain the conquest, is much debated by historians. The sources are late and uncertain, and the truth is hard to recover. But the story became part of the legend of the conquest. The idea that the Aztecs were paralyzed by uncertainty about whether the strangers were gods, that the prophecy of Quetzalcoatl's return clouded their response. Whatever the truth, the last years of the independent empire would be remembered as a time of omens and unease, of gathering shadow. And into this troubled world, in the year 1519, the strangers came. In the year 1519, there arrived on the eastern coast of Mexico a force of strangers unlike any the peoples of that land had ever seen. Men from across the Great Sea, from the kingdoms of Europe, come in search of wealth and dominion, whose arrival would set in motion the swift and catastrophic fall of the Aztec Empire. We come now to the conquest, one of the most momentous, dramatic, and tragic episodes in human history, the collision of two worlds that had developed in total isolation from each other, and the destruction of a great civilization. We will tell it as fairly and humanely as we can, for it is a story of immense suffering and loss, and one that has been told in many ways and remains the subject of deep reflection. The strangers were Spaniards, part of the great wave of European expansion that, in the decades after the first European voyages to the Americas, had brought Spanish adventurers, soldiers, and settlers to the islands of the Caribbean, and now, increasingly, to the mainland, in search of gold, land, glory, and converts to their religion. The expedition that landed on the Mexican coast in 1519 was led by Hernán Cortés, an ambitious and audacious Spanish captain, who came with a small force, only several hundred men, with a handful of horses, animals unknown in the Americas, some cannon and firearms, and steel weapons and armor. It was a tiny force to challenge a mighty empire of millions, and yet, through a combination of factors, this small band of strangers would, in the space of about 2 years, bring down the Aztec Empire. How could so few overcome so many? The answer lies in a combination of causes, and it is important to understand them. For the conquest was not the simple triumph of a handful of Europeans over a great empire that the legend sometimes suggests. The Spanish had certain military advantages: steel weapons and armor, firearms and cannon, and horses, which were terrifying and unknown to the Aztecs, and gave the Spanish mobility and shock in battle. But these advantages, real as they were not by themselves decisive against the vast numbers of the Aztecs. Far more important were two other factors. The first was the deep hatred of the Aztecs among their subject and rival peoples, for the Spanish, as they marched inland, found a vast supply of allies among the peoples who groaned under Aztec domination and tribute, or who, like the Tlaxcalans, had resisted Aztec conquest and nursed a bitter enmity. Without these native allies, who joined the Spanish in enormous numbers and provided the bulk of the fighting force, the conquest would have been impossible. It was, in large part, a great revolt of subject and rival peoples against the Aztec Empire, with the Spanish as catalyst and spearhead. The second, and ultimately the most lethal factor, was disease. The Europeans brought with them, all unknowing, the diseases of the Old World, smallpox above all, and others, to which the peoples of the Americas, isolated for thousands of years, had no immunity whatever. These diseases would sweep through the native population with catastrophic, almost unimaginable mortality, killing a great part of the population in a series of devastating epidemics, a biological catastrophe that, more than any battle, would shatter the Aztec world and the whole native population of the Americas. In the specific story of the conquest, a smallpox epidemic that struck at a crucial moment would devastate the defenders of Tenochtitlan and play a decisive role in the city's fall. The conquest, then, was the product of these combined causes: Spanish weapons and audacity, the vast armies of native allies who hated the Aztecs, and above all, the invisible catastrophe of disease, and not simply the heroic triumph of legend. With these things in mind, let us follow the course of events, as Cortés and his men, having landed on the coast, began their fateful march toward the great city on the lake. From their landing on the coast, Cortés and his small force began the long march inland toward the heart of the Aztec Empire and its great capital, Tenochtitlan, a march of audacity and danger, through the territories of many peoples, during which the Spanish gathered the allies who would make the conquest possible and drew steadily nearer to the fateful meeting with Moctezuma. The march inland is a story of diplomacy and violence, of alliance and intimidation, as the small band of strangers made its way toward the city on the lake. Early in their venture, the Spanish gained an invaluable asset, an interpreter, a native woman who came to serve as Cortés's translator and advisor, able to bridge the languages and cultures, and who played a crucial role in the diplomacy and intelligence of the expedition. Through her, and through the contacts they made, the Spanish learned of the Aztec Empire, its wealth and power, its capital, and, crucially, the resentments and divisions among its peoples. As they moved inland, the Spanish encountered various peoples, some hostile, some curious, and began to gather information and, where they could, allies, presenting themselves as a new and powerful force in the politics of the land. The decisive alliance came with the Tlaxcalans, the fiercely independent people whom the Aztecs had never conquered, who lived as a hostile enclave surrounded by Aztec power, and who hated the Mexica with a deep and long-nursed enmity. When the Spanish first entered Tlaxcalan territory, the Tlaxcalans fought them fiercely, but after hard fighting, and recognizing in the strangers a potential ally against their hated Aztec enemies, the Tlaxcalans made peace and alliance with the Spanish, becoming their crucial partners in the war against the Aztecs. This alliance was the turning point that made the conquest possible. The Tlaxcalans provided the Spanish with a powerful, motivated, and numerous native army, with a secure base, with supplies and intelligence and warriors in their tens of thousands. From this point, the campaign against the Aztecs was as much a Tlaxcalan and native war against their Mexica overlords as it was a Spanish conquest, a great coalition of the enemies of the Aztec Empire, with the Spanish at its head. As the Spanish and their growing native army marched onward toward Tenochtitlan, there occurred a dark and controversial episode at the city of Cholula, a major city allied to, or subject to the Aztecs, where the Spanish, claiming to have discovered a plot against them, carried out a massacre of the inhabitants. The episode is remembered as one of the grim events of the march, an act of violence and intimidation whose causes and justifications are disputed, but which demonstrated the ruthlessness of the campaign and spread fear before the advancing strangers. Such acts of violence and intimidation, alongside diplomacy and alliance, marked the Spanish progress toward the capital, and so, gathering allies, fighting and negotiating their way forward, The Spanish and their native army drew at last near to the Valley of Mexico and the great city on the lake. The approach to Tenochtitlan astonished the Spanish. The sight of the Great Lakes, the cities ringing the shores, and above all the magnificent capital itself, rising white and splendid from the water, joined to the land by its great causeways, more beautiful and more impressive than anything they had imagined or known in Europe. They could scarcely believe their eyes, declaring it a vision, a dream, a wonder beyond belief. And as they descended toward the valley and approached the city, the fateful moment drew near. The meeting of the two worlds, of the Spanish captain and the Aztec emperor, of Cortés and Moctezuma, at the gates of the great city. Moctezuma, uncertain how to respond to these strange and powerful newcomers, whether they were gods or men, friends or enemies, whether to fight them or receive them, had hesitated, sent gifts and embassies, tried to dissuade them from coming, and finally, fatefully, resolved to receive them. And so, in November of 1519, the Spanish marched along the great causeway into Tenochtitlan, and Cortés and Moctezuma met face to face. In November of 1519, the Spanish force, with its native allies, marched along the great southern causeway into the city of Tenochtitlan, and there, amid scenes of extraordinary ceremony and tension, the Spanish captain Cortés met the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma face to face, one of the most extraordinary encounters in all of human history, the meeting of two worlds that had never known of each other's existence, at the height of the Aztec splendor and on the eve of its destruction. We should pause on this moment, for it is one of the great dramatic hinges of history. The meeting was conducted with elaborate courtesy and ceremony. Moctezuma, in his majesty, came forth to receive the strangers, born in great state, adorned with the splendor of his rank. Cortés and his men, awed by the magnificence of the emperor and the city, were received as honored guests. There was an exchange of greetings, of gifts, of formal speeches. The emperor lodged the Spanish in a great palace within the city, and for a time the strangers dwelt as guests in the heart of the Aztec capital, amid wonders that astonished them. The great markets, the towering temples, the palaces and gardens, the teeming, ordered, magnificent city floating on its lake. The Spanish, walking through Tenochtitlan in those first days, recorded their wonder at its size, beauty, and order, at the abundance of its markets and the splendor of its buildings, marveling that such a city existed in a world they had thought barbarous. But beneath the ceremony and the wonder lay deep tension, suspicion, and danger, for the situation was fraught and unstable. The Spanish were a tiny force in the midst of a vast and powerful city, deep in the heart of an empire that could destroy them, dependent on the uncertain goodwill or hesitation of the emperor. Moctezuma's own response was hesitant and ambivalent, whether out of religious uncertainty about the nature of the strangers, or political calculation, or a hope to learn their intentions, or simple miscalculation. He had received them rather than resisting them, and now they were within his city, honored guests and yet a growing threat. The relationship between the emperor and his guests was a thing of profound and unstable tension, courtesy masking suspicion, hospitality shadowed by danger. And then the Spanish made a bold and treacherous move that transformed the situation. They seized the emperor. Within a short time of entering the city, Cortés and his men took Moctezuma captive, seizing the person of the emperor within his own capital, holding him as a hostage and a puppet, seeking to rule the empire through the captive monarch, to control the great city and its empire by controlling its lord. It was an audacious and astonishing stroke. A few hundred strangers seizing the emperor of a mighty empire in the midst of his own capital and people. And for a time it worked, with Moctezuma held captive, issuing commands at the direction of his captors, the Spanish ruling in effect, through the puppet emperor, extracting treasure and submission, while the bewildered city looked on. The exact circumstances and motives, on all sides, are debated and uncertain, but the result was that the emperor became a prisoner in his own palace, and the Spanish held a precarious and extraordinary control over the heart of the empire. This strange and unstable situation, the emperor a captive, the Spanish ruling through him, the great city simmering with confusion and growing resentment, could not last. The tension mounted. The Aztec nobility and people grew ever more restive and angry at the captivity of their lord and the presence and demands of the strangers. The Spanish position, dependent on the captive emperor and surrounded by a vast and increasingly hostile population, grew ever more precarious. The situation was a powder keg, and it needed only a spark to explode. That spark would come, and when it did, the fragile arrangement would collapse into open violence, and the Spanish would find themselves trapped in the midst of a great city risen in fury against them. The meeting of the two worlds, which had begun in ceremony and wonder, was about to turn to bloodshed and catastrophe. The fragile and unstable arrangement by which the Spanish held the captive emperor and ruled precariously in Tenochtitlan collapsed, in the year 1520, into open violence, and the Spanish, trapped in the midst of a great city risen in fury against them, suffered a catastrophic defeat as they fled the capital, in the disastrous night that the Spanish themselves would remember as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. We come now to the violent unraveling of the conquest's first phase, told with restraint, for it was a time of much death and suffering on all sides. The crisis came while Cortés was briefly absent from the city, having gone to deal with a rival Spanish force that had landed on the coast. In his absence, the Spanish he had left in command of Tenochtitlan, amid the rising tension, carried out a massacre of Aztec nobles and warriors gathered for a religious festival in the sacred precinct, a slaughter of unarmed celebrants that turned the simmering resentment of the city into open fury and revolt. The people of Tenochtitlan rose in arms against the strangers who had seized their emperor and now massacred their nobles at worship. The city erupted in rebellion, and the Spanish, with their allies, found themselves besieged in their quarters, surrounded by a vast and enraged population determined to destroy them. The fragile arrangement had shattered. The Aztecs were in open war against the invaders in the heart of their own city. In the midst of this crisis, the Emperor Moctezuma died, and the circumstances of his death are uncertain and disputed. According to the most common account, the Spanish brought the captive emperor out to address his people and to try to calm the revolt, but the people, enraged, having perhaps already repudiated him as a captive and a puppet, turned on him, hurling stones and missiles, and Moctezuma was struck and mortally wounded, dying soon after. Other accounts suggest he may have been killed by the Spanish when he was no longer of use to them. However he died, the last great emperor of the independent Aztec Empire perished in the chaos of the revolt. His authority already broken, his death a final blow to the old order, a tragic end for the proud monarch, whose hesitation and miscalculation, whatever their causes, had allowed the strangers into his city and into his power. With the city in full revolt and their position hopeless, the Spanish resolved to flee Tenochtitlan by night, to escape along one of the great causeways out of the city before they were overwhelmed. And so, on a rainy night in the summer of 1520, the Spanish and their native allies attempted to slip out of the city in secret, laden with as much treasure as they could carry, hoping to cross the causeway and escape to the mainland under cover of darkness. But they were discovered, and the alarm was raised, and the Aztecs fell upon them in fury as they fled along the causeway, attacking from canoes on either side, from the city behind, all along the narrow road across the water. In the darkness and rain, on the exposed causeway, attacked from all sides, the Spanish flight became a rout and a disaster. Many were killed or drowned, dragged down by the weight of the treasure they tried to carry, falling from the causeway into the lake, cut off and overwhelmed. A great part of the Spanish force perished that night, along with many of their native allies, in one of the worst defeats the conquistadors ever suffered. The survivors, Cortés among them, fought their way out and escaped, battered and broken, having lost many men, much treasure, and their hold on the city. The Night of Sorrows was a catastrophe for the Spanish, a shattering defeat that drove them from Tenochtitlan, cost them a large part of their force, and might have ended the conquest altogether. The Aztecs had risen and cast out the invaders. The great city was free again, the strangers driven away in disaster. For a moment, it might have seemed that the Aztec Empire had survived the crisis, had thrown off the threat, had won, but it was not so. The Spanish, though battered, were not destroyed. They retreated to the friendly territory of their Tlaxcalan allies, where they regrouped, rested, and rebuilt their strength, gathering their native allies for a return. And meanwhile, a new and far more terrible enemy had entered the city behind them, for the invaders had left behind, all unknowing, the invisible killer that would do more than any army to destroy the Aztec world, the smallpox, which now began to spread through Tenochtitlan and the valley, beginning the catastrophe of disease that would devastate the defenders even as they celebrated their victory. The Night of Sorrows had driven out the Spanish, but it had not saved the Aztec Empire, whose doom was now approaching in the form of the gathering allies, the regrouping invaders, and above all the silent, spreading plague. After their disastrous flight on the Night of Sorrows, the Spanish regrouped among their Tlaxcalan allies, rebuilt their strength, gathered a vast army of native allies who hated the Aztecs, and returned to lay siege to Tenochtitlan. And in the year 1521, after a long and terrible siege, the great city fell, and the Aztec Empire came to its end. We come now to the final act of the tragedy told soberly, for it was a time of immense suffering, destruction and death, the end of a civilization. While the Spanish gathered their forces, the catastrophe of disease did its work within the city. The smallpox epidemic, against which the native peoples had no immunity, swept through Tenochtitlan and the surrounding lands with devastating mortality, killing a great part of the population, including warriors, leaders, and a new emperor who had been chosen after Moctezuma's death. The disease ravaged the city, weakening its defenses, killing its defenders, sowing death and terror, striking down the population in numbers no army could have matched. This biological catastrophe, more than any battle, broke the strength of the Aztec resistance, devastating the city before the siege even began in earnest. It was an enemy the Aztecs could neither see nor fight nor comprehend, and it did more to doom them than all the weapons of the Spanish. The Spanish, reinforced and supported by a huge army of native allies, Tlaxcalans and others, in their tens or hundreds of thousands, far outnumbering the Spanish themselves, returned to the Valley of Mexico and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. To overcome the city's defenses, protected by its water and causeways, the Spanish built boats to control the lake, cut the causeways and the aqueduct that brought fresh water to the city, and surrounded it, seeking to starve and batter it into submission. The new young emperor who now led the Aztecs, the last lord of Tenochtitlan, organized a fierce and determined defense, and the Aztecs fought with great courage and tenacity to defend their city, resisting the besiegers in desperate battles along the causeways and through the streets and canals. The siege was long, brutal, and terrible, lasting for months, and it brought immense suffering to the people of Tenochtitlan, cut off from food and fresh water, ravaged by disease, battered by the besiegers. The population suffered famine, thirst, sickness, and death on a vast scale. Even as the warriors fought on with desperate courage, the Spanish and their allies fought their way into the city street by street, canal by canal, in fierce and bloody fighting, destroying as they advanced, reducing the great city to ruin. The defenders resisted with extraordinary determination and bravery, fighting for every position, refusing to surrender, enduring terrible suffering. But the combination of disease, starvation, the vast numbers of the besieging army, and the relentless advance gradually overwhelmed them. The beautiful city on the lake was being systematically destroyed, its people dying in vast numbers, its splendor reduced to rubble and corpses. At last, in August of 1521, after months of siege and the near-total destruction of the city, Tenochtitlan fell. The last emperor was captured trying to escape. The resistance collapsed. The great city, or what remained of it, surrendered. The Aztec Empire was at an end. The magnificent capital that had floated in splendor upon its lake, that had astonished the Spanish with its beauty and order and abundance, lay in ruins, its temples thrown down, its palaces destroyed, its canals choked with rubble and the dead, its population devastated by war, disease, and famine. The proud empire that had risen from wandering refugees to mastery of a vast realm, that had stood at the height of its power and glory only 2 years before, had been utterly destroyed by the Spanish, by the great army of native peoples who had risen against their Aztec overlords, and above all by the invisible catastrophe of disease. In the space of about 2 years, one of the greatest civilizations of the Americas had been brought down, its capital ruined, its empire shattered, its world ended. It was one of the most complete and dramatic catastrophes in all of history, the sudden fall, from the height of power to total ruin, of a great and ancient civilization. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 ended the Aztec Empire, but it did not, in an instant, erase the Aztec world. What followed was a long, painful transformation, in which much was destroyed and lost, but much also endured, transformed and submerged into the new world that arose upon the ruins of the old. We should consider both the destruction and the survival, what was lost in the catastrophe, and what remained. The immediate aftermath of the conquest was catastrophic for the native peoples of Mexico. Upon the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish built their own capital, the city that would become Mexico City, raising their churches and palaces upon the rubble of the Aztec temples and using the very stones of the destroyed city. The Spanish imposed their rule, their religion, their language, and their social order upon the conquered land, establishing the colony that would endure for 3 centuries. The old religion was suppressed and its temples destroyed. The painted books were burned, the native nobility was displaced or absorbed. The whole structure of the Aztec world was dismantled and replaced, and the catastrophe of disease continued, epidemic after epidemic sweeping through the native population over the following decades, killing a great part of the people of Mexico in one of the most devastating demographic collapses in human history. The native population falling, over the century after the conquest, to a small fraction of what it had been. The human cost of the conquest and its aftermath was almost unimaginable. The death of millions, the destruction of a civilization, the collapse of a whole world, and yet, amid this destruction, much also survived, transformed, submerged, but enduring. The native peoples themselves endured. Though devastated, they were not destroyed, and their descendants remained the great majority of the population, surviving through the colonial centuries and into the present. The native languages endured. Above all, the Aztec language, Nahuatl, which is still spoken by well over 1 million people in Mexico today, a living link to the Aztec world. Many elements of native culture endured and blended with the Spanish, in food, in custom, in art, in religion, in language, in countless features of the new mestizo civilization that arose from the mixing of native and Spanish worlds. The cuisine of Mexico still rests on the maize, the beans, the chilies, the chocolate, the tomatoes of the native world. Countless words, place names, customs and traditions carry the Aztec inheritance. The very identity of modern Mexico is rooted, profoundly, in its native and Aztec past. The memory of the Aztecs endured as well, and was preserved, through the post-conquest compilations of the friars and native writers, through the surviving codices, through the oral traditions, through the very ruins buried beneath the colonial city. And in time, the Aztec past would come to be embraced as a foundation of Mexican national identity. The eagle on the cactus, the founding symbol of Tenochtitlan, becoming the emblem at the heart of the flag of modern Mexico, the names and images of the Aztec world, becoming sources of national pride and identity. The rediscovery and excavation of the Aztec past, becoming a great enterprise of Mexican archaeology and scholarship. The civilization that the conquest had destroyed would rise again in memory, reclaimed as a glorious heritage, a foundation of identity, a source of pride for the nation that arose upon its ruins. So the fall of the Aztec Empire was not a simple ending, but a transformation, a catastrophe of destruction and death, in which a great civilization was brought down and a whole world ended. And yet also a survival and a blending, in which the native peoples, languages, cultures and memories endured, transformed into the new world that arose. The Aztec world was destroyed as an empire, a religion, a political order, but it survived as a people, a language, a heritage, a memory, an inheritance woven into the very identity of modern Mexico. What was lost was immense and tragic, but what remained was also great, and endures to this day, in the living descendants, the living language, and the living memory of the Aztec world. The Aztec Empire fell 5 centuries ago, its capital destroyed, its empire shattered, its world ended in catastrophe. And yet the Aztecs have not been forgotten. Their memory endures, their inheritance lives on, and they hold a powerful place in the imagination of Mexico and the world. As we near the end of our long journey through their world, let us reflect on the legacy of the Aztecs and what they mean to us today. The most profound legacy of the Aztecs lies in modern Mexico itself, whose identity is rooted deeply in its native and Aztec past. The very heart of Mexico, its capital, Mexico City, built upon the ruins of Tenochtitlan on the drained bed of the vanished lake, stands upon the Aztec foundation, and the buried remains of the Aztec world lie beneath the modern metropolis, occasionally emerging, as when the great temple at the city's heart was uncovered. The founding legend of the Aztecs, the eagle perched upon the cactus, the sign that marked the site of Tenochtitlan, has become the central emblem of the Mexican nation, displayed at the heart of its flag, a symbol of national identity carried by every Mexican. The Aztec language, Nahuatl, lives on, spoken by well over 1 million people. Aztec words have entered the languages of the world. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, chili, and many others derive from Nahuatl. Aztec foods nourish the world. The blood, the culture, the language, the identity of modern Mexico are woven through with the Aztec inheritance. The Aztecs also endure as a subject of fascination and study, one of the great civilizations of the pre-modern world, whose achievements in engineering, agriculture, art, astronomy, social organization, and statecraft command admiration and wonder. Their building of a great city upon a lake, their astonishing agriculture of the Chinampas, their elaborate social, political and economic order, their sophisticated calendars and astronomy, their magnificent art and featherwork, their rich poetry and philosophy, their grand and terrible religion. All of these mark the Aztecs as one of the truly remarkable civilizations of human history, an achievement of the human spirit that arose in isolation from the old world and developed its own brilliant and distinctive answers to the challenges of building a civilization. And the Aztecs endure, too, as a subject of reflection on some of the deepest themes of history, on the rise and fall of civilizations, on the collision of cultures, on the catastrophe of conquest and disease, on the terrible drama of the meeting of the old world and the new. The fall of the Aztec Empire is one of the great tragedies and turning points of history. The sudden destruction of a great civilization, the collision of two worlds that had never known of each other, the catastrophe that befell the native peoples of the Americas with the coming of the Europeans and their diseases. It invites reflection on the fragility of civilizations, on the contingency of history, on the immense human cost of conquest and colonization, on the value of what was lost and the meaning of what survived. The Aztecs stand as a powerful reminder of the greatness that human civilizations can achieve, and of the catastrophe that can befall them, of the brilliance and the terror that can coexist in a single culture, of the tragedy of a great world destroyed, and the endurance of a people and a heritage through catastrophe. To remember the Aztecs is to remember a civilization of astonishing achievement and profound contradiction, builders of a magnificent city on a lake, masters of agriculture and art and statecraft, poets who meditated on the fleeting beauty of life, and also a people of grand and terrible religion, of war and sacrifice, of empire and domination. It is to remember a world that rose from wandering refugees to imperial splendor in 2 short centuries, and fell from splendor to ruin in 2 short years. It is to remember the great city that floated upon its shining lake, the eagle upon the cactus, the towering temples, the teeming markets, the eagle and jaguar warriors, the gods and the poetry and the maze, a whole world, brilliant and terrible and beautiful, that flourished for a time in the high valley of the lakes, and then was gone. The Aztecs are gone, their empire fallen, their world ended, but their memory endures, their inheritance lives, and their story remains one of the great and unforgettable chapters in the long history of humankind. Now that we have followed the Aztec story to its end and reflected on its legacy, let us return, before we let the tale settle into the quiet of the night, to a few aspects of their world that we have not yet touched. For there is more to know of how they understood life and death and the heavens and the deep order of their cosmos. And we begin with their vision of death and the afterlife, which was as distinctive as everything else about them. The Aztecs had a complex vision of death and the afterlife, one that differed strikingly from the ideas of heaven and hell familiar from other traditions. For in the Aztec view, the destination of the dead was determined not chiefly by how one had lived, by virtue or sin, but rather by how one had died, by the manner of one's death. The fate of the soul depended on the kind of death one met, and the different manners of death led to different afterlives, a distinctive and revealing vision of the order of things. Most people, those who died ordinary deaths, of sickness or old age, the common fate, were believed to journey to Mictlan, the underworld, the land of the dead, ruled by the Lord and Lady of the dead. But the journey to Mictlan was long and arduous, a difficult passage of several years through a series of trials and dangers, across rivers and mountains, and through cold winds and perils, before the soul reached the deepest level of the underworld and found its rest. The dead were buried or cremated with goods and offerings to aid them on this difficult journey, provisions for the long road through the underworld, including, it was said, a dog to accompany and help the soul across the rivers of the dead. Mictlan was not a place of punishment, but simply the final destination of the ordinary dead, reached after the long and difficult journey through the underworld. A quiet ending, the common lot. But certain kinds of death led to other, more honored afterlives. Warriors who died in battle, and captives who were sacrificed, and, as we have seen, women who died in childbirth, were believed to attain a special and honored afterlife, different from the common journey to Mictlan. The warriors who died in battle, or on the sacrificial stone, were thought to join the sun, to accompany the sun god on part of his daily journey across the sky, sharing in the glory of the sun, a high honor reflecting the supreme value placed on the warrior's death and the feeding of the sun. The women who died in childbirth, honored as the equivalent of warriors, were thought to accompany the sun on another part of its journey. And those who died by water, by drowning or by certain diseases associated with the rain god, were believed to go to a paradise of the rain god, a green and pleasant place of abundance and ease, the paradise of Tlaloc, a blessed afterlife for those whom the rain god had claimed. This vision, in which the manner of death, rather than the conduct of life, determined the afterlife, reveals much about the Aztec view of the world, the supreme value placed on the warrior's death and the feeding of the sun, the honor accorded to the woman's death in childbirth, the sense of the cosmos as a place of struggle and offering, in which a death in the service of the sun, or the gods, earned a glory denied to ordinary death. It was a vision without the moral judgment of heaven and hell, focused instead on the manner of death and its place in the great cosmic order of sun and rain and struggle. And it gave the warrior, and the sacrificial victim, and the mother dead in childbirth, a glory and an honor in death that reflected the deepest values of the Aztec world, the feeding of the sun, the struggle to sustain the cosmos, the giving of life and death in the service of the gods and the people. Among the achievements of the Aztecs, and of the Mesoamerican civilizations they inherited from, were remarkable accomplishments in astronomy, mathematics, and the keeping of knowledge. For these were peoples who watched the heavens with great attention, counted time with great precision, and developed sophisticated learning in many fields. Let us consider the knowledge and learning of the Aztec world, which is sometimes overshadowed by the drama of their religion and their fall. The Aztecs, like other Mesoamerican peoples, were keen and careful observers of the heavens, for the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars were of the greatest importance to them, governing their calendars, their religious festivals, their agriculture, their sense of cosmic order. They tracked the movements of the heavenly bodies with great care, observing the sun's path through the year, the phases of the moon, the cycles of the planet Venus, which held great significance in Mesoamerican astronomy and religion, the patterns of the stars. Their priests and astronomers studied the heavens from the temples and observatories, recording and predicting the celestial cycles, integrating their observations into the elaborate calendars that governed religious and agricultural life. This astronomical knowledge was sophisticated and precise, the fruit of long and careful observation, and it underlay the remarkable calendar systems we have already considered, the meshing solar and sacred calendars, the great 52-year cycle, the careful counting of days and years. In mathematics, the Aztecs inherited and used a sophisticated system of numbers and counting, a system based, like that of other Mesoamerican peoples, on units of 20, a vigesimal system, counting by 20s rather than by 10s as we do, with symbols for numbers that allowed them to record and calculate the large quantities needed for their tribute accounts, their calendars, their astronomical reckonings, and the administration of their empire. The tribute rolls, with their meticulous records of the quantities of goods owed by each province, attest to the practical mathematics of the Aztec state. The calendars attest to their reckoning of cycles and numbers. Their whole administration depended on the keeping of accounts and records in their numerical system. In medicine and the knowledge of the natural world, the Aztecs were also accomplished. They had an extensive knowledge of plants and their medicinal properties, a rich pharmacopoeia of herbs and remedies used to treat illnesses and injuries, and a class of healers and physicians skilled in the use of these medicines and in various treatments. Their botanical knowledge was remarkable. The great royal gardens served partly as collections of medicinal and useful plants, and the Aztecs catalogued and used a vast range of plants for medicine, food, and other purposes. The Spanish who studied the Aztec world recorded much of this botanical and medical knowledge, impressed by its sophistication. Some Aztec remedies and botanical knowledge would pass into wider use. The Aztecs also had knowledge of anatomy, of the treatment of wounds, sharpened perhaps by the experience of warfare, of the setting of bones, and of various medical practices, combining practical treatment with religious and ritual elements. And the Aztecs were keepers and transmitters of knowledge through their system of writing and their painted books, and through the rigorous education of their schools, where the accumulated learning of their civilization, history, religion, astronomy, the calendar, law, rhetoric, the law of the gods, was preserved and passed on to each new generation. The priests and scholars were the keepers of this knowledge, masters of the codices and the calendars and the traditions, the learned class who preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of the Aztec world. Though much of this learning was lost in the catastrophe of the conquest and the burning of the books, enough survived, in the codices that remain, in the post-conquest compilations, in the knowledge recorded by those who studied the Aztec world before it vanished, to show us a civilization of real intellectual achievement, watchers of the heavens, counters of time, masters of a sophisticated mathematics, knowers of plants and medicine, keepers of a rich tradition of learning, whose accomplishments of mind deserve to be remembered alongside the drama of their empire and the tragedy of their fall. Now that we have wandered through the whole of the Aztec world, its rise and its splendor, its gods and its warriors, its achievements and its fall, let us pause, before we gather the story together one last time, to reflect on the great themes that run through it, the deeper meanings that the story of the Aztecs holds. The first great theme is the rise and fall of civilizations, for the story of the Aztecs is one of the most dramatic examples in all of history of a civilization's rise from nothing to greatness, and its fall from greatness to ruin. The Aztecs rose, in scarcely 2 centuries, from despised wandering refugees to the masters of a mighty empire and the builders of one of the world's great cities, and they fell, in scarcely 2 years, from the height of that power to total destruction. The suddenness and completeness of both the rise and the fall make the Aztec story a powerful meditation on the fortunes of civilizations, on how greatness can be built and how swiftly it can be destroyed, on the contingency and fragility of even the mightiest human achievements. The second great theme is the collision of worlds, for the fall of the Aztecs came about through one of the most dramatic encounters in all of history, the meeting of 2 worlds, the old world and the new, that had developed in total isolation from each other for thousands of years, and that collided suddenly and catastrophically in the early 16th century. The conquest of the Aztecs was a moment when 2 utterly separate streams of human history met, with consequences catastrophic for the native peoples of the Americas, who suffered conquest, colonization, and above all the devastating catastrophe of new diseases. The Aztec story invites reflection on this great collision, on its causes and its consequences, on the immense human cost of the meeting of worlds and the European expansion that reshaped the globe. The third great theme is the complexity and contradiction of a civilization. For the Aztecs were a people of profound contradictions, and their story resists simple judgment. They were builders of beauty and order, masters of art and engineering and agriculture, poets who meditated on the fleeting beauty of life, keepers of learning and law and refined custom, and they were also a people of grand and terrible religion, of war and sacrifice, of empire and domination, whose practices included things that horrify us. To understand the Aztecs is to hold these contradictions together, to see both the brilliance and the terror, to resist both the romanticizing that ignores the darkness and the demonizing that ignores the achievement. They were, like all human civilizations, a complex mixture of greatness and cruelty, of beauty and horror, and their story teaches us to see civilizations whole, in all their contradiction. The fourth great theme is the value of what is lost, and the endurance of memory, for the conquest destroyed the Aztec world, burned its books, ended its empire, and devastated its people, in one of history's great catastrophes of destruction, and yet much survived, transformed and submerged, into the new world that arose, and the memory of the Aztecs endures, reclaimed and honored, woven into the identity of modern Mexico. The Aztec story is thus a meditation on loss and survival, on the destruction of a world and the endurance of a people and a heritage through catastrophe, on the way that even a civilization that is destroyed can live on in memory, in language, in blood, in identity. What was lost was immense and tragic, but what remained endures, and the memory of the Aztecs lives. These are the great themes that the story of the Aztecs holds: the rise and fall of civilizations, the collision of worlds, the complexity and contradiction of a culture, and the value of what is lost, and the endurance of memory. They are among the deepest themes of all human history, and the Aztec story embodies them with extraordinary power and poignancy, which is part of why it continues to fascinate, to move, and to instruct us, 5 centuries after the great city on the lake fell silent. And now, having reflected on these themes, let us gather the whole story together one last time, before we let it settle into the quiet of the night. We have come to the end of our long journey through the world of the Aztecs, and before we let the story settle into the quiet of the night, let us gather the whole of it together once more, and hold for a moment the great shape of the tale we have followed, the entire story of the Aztec Empire, from its wandering beginnings to its splendid height and its sudden fall. We began in a high valley ringed by mountains and filled with a shining lake, the Valley of Mexico, the cradle of the Aztec world, and with the great city of Tenochtitlan that once floated upon its waters. We learnt how the story comes down to us, through the few surviving painted books, the accounts of friars and conquerors and native writers, and the findings of archaeology, a world half recovered from the catastrophe that destroyed it. We saw the ancient world the Aztecs inherited, the vanished greatness of Teotihuacan and the Toltecs, the long Mesoamerican tradition of which the Aztecs were the heirs and the latecomers. We followed the Mexica on their long migration from the legendary homeland of Aztlan, led by their god Huitzilopochtli, a despised and wandering people searching for their promised home, until they found the sign their god had foretold. The eagle perched upon the cactus and founded Tenochtitlan upon its marshy island in the year 1325. We watched the city rise from the waters, the chinampas and canals and causeways, the dikes and aqueducts, the engineering that transformed a swamp into a magnificent metropolis. We explored the order of Aztec society, the Tlatoani and the nobles, the commoners and the Calpulli, the merchants and the slaves, the family and the schools, the strict moral order and the rigorous education. We saw the building of the empire, the formation of the Triple Alliance, the machinery of tribute and conquest, the rise of the Mexica from subjects to masters, the long-distance merchants who walked to the edges of the world, the great market of Tlatelolco with its tens of thousands of traders, the food and farming, the sacred maize and the bounty of the lake that fed the great city. We entered the sacred heart of Tenochtitlan, the great precinct and the towering Templo Maya, with its twin shrines to the war god and the rain god, the palaces and gardens of the rulers. We tried to understand the Aztec religion, the great pantheon of gods, Huitzilopochtli the sun and war god, patron of the Mexica, Quetzalcoatl the feathered serpent, Tezcatlipoca the smoking mirror, Tlaloc the giver of rain, the cosmology of the five suns and the precarious borrowed world, the elaborate calendars and the counting of time, and the solemn and terrible practice of sacrifice, the feeding of the sun, that flowed from their vision of a cosmos sustained by offering. We met the eagle and jaguar warriors, learned of the flower wars, and saw how war and religion and the taking of captives were bound together at the center of the Aztec world. And we saw the other face of the civilization, the magnificent art and featherwork, the poetry of flower and song with its meditations on the fleeting beauty of life, the knowledge of the heavens and the plants, the refinement and learning that balanced the war and the sacrifice, the rhythm of daily life, the homes and food and clothing and festivals, the women who sustained the households and the families and much of the world. And then we came to the rulers, and to the height of the empire under its great conquering kings, when the Aztec power reached its zenith and Tenochtitlan stood among the greatest cities in the world, and to the omens and unease of the final years and the last great emperor, Moctezuma, and then to the catastrophe, the coming of the strangers from the sea in 1519, the march of Cortes and his men inland, gathering the allies who hated the Aztecs, above all the Tlaxcalans, the fateful meeting of Moctezuma and Cortes, and the seizure of the emperor, the rising tension, the massacre and the revolt, the death of Moctezuma, the disastrous flight of the Night of Sorrows, and then the return, the siege, the catastrophe of smallpox, and the long and terrible fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the destruction of the great city, the end of the empire, the fall of a civilization in the space of 2 short years, through Spanish arms, native allies, and the invisible plague. And we saw the aftermath, the immense destruction and death, the catastrophe of disease, the building of a new world upon the ruins of the old, and also the survival, the endurance of the people, the language, the culture, the memory, woven into the identity of modern Mexico, the eagle on the cactus at the heart of its flag. This is the whole great shape of it, the entire story of the Aztec Empire, from the wandering of the Mexica to the founding of Tenochtitlan, from the rise of the empire to its glittering height, from the coming of the strangers to the fall of the great city on the lake, one of the most dramatic and tragic stories in all of human history, the rise and fall of a lost civilization. And now the long journey is over, and it is time to let the story settle, and to let yourself drift down at last into sleep. So let the great city grow quiet now in your mind, Tenochtitlan in the evening, at the height of its glory, before the strangers came. Let the canoes glide slowly home across the still water as the sun sinks behind the mountains. Let the smoke rise straight and thin from the temples into the windless air. Let the great market fall silent as the traders pack away their goods and drift homeward along the canals. Let the lamps be lit in the houses, one by one, across the island city, their soft glow reflected in the dark water. Let the eagle and jaguar warriors lay down their arms and rest. Let the priests fall silent, and the long day's labor cease, and the whole great city on the lake settle softly into the warm and quiet night. Picture the lake at evening, calm and still and luminous, the last gold of the sunset fading from its surface, The great volcanoes, standing dark against the deepening sky, their snow-capped peaks catching the final light. Picture the white city floating upon the water, its temples and palaces dim now in the gathering dusk, joined to the dark shores by the long pale lines of the causeways. Picture the stars beginning to appear, one by one, in the great bowl of the sky above the valley, and their reflections trembling in the still water of the lake. The city is at peace, the day is done, the warm night comes down over the valley of the lakes, soft and deep and kind. All of this was real once. The great city on the lake, the eagle on the cactus, the towering temples and the teeming markets, the warriors and the poets and the gods, the whole brilliant and terrible and beautiful world we have wandered through tonight. It rose, and it flourished, and it fell, long ago, and it is gone now. The lake drained, the city buried, the empire ended, the world vanished into memory, but for a time it shone, magnificent, upon its shining lake, high in the valley of the mountains, and tonight we have remembered it, and walked through it, and seen it whole. And now we can let it go, gently, and let it settle into the quiet of the past, where it rests. So let your eyes close now, if they have not already closed. Let your breathing grow slow and deep and easy, like the calm water of the lake at evening. Let every part of you grow heavy and still and at peace. Let the cares of your day fade away, like the last gold fading from the water as the sun goes down behind the mountains. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. The great city is at rest upon its lake. The warriors sleep. The markets are quiet. The stars are out over the valley. And you too can rest now, and let yourself drift down, gently and easily, into sleep. Thank you for spending this long journey with me, wandering through the world of the Aztecs, through the rise and fall of the great city on the lake. If you have found some peace in this telling, you are always welcome to return. There are many more worlds to wander through, many more civilizations and stories waiting in the quiet evenings to come, and I would be glad to walk through them with you. If you would like to share where you are listening from tonight, or which part of the story stayed with you, you are welcome to leave a quiet word in the comments, but only if you are still awake, and only if it pleases you. There is no need. The only thing left to do now is to rest. So let the lake grow still and dark. Let the white city fade into the night. Let the stars come out over the valley of the mountains, and let the whole great world we have remembered settle softly into sleep. Rest now. Breathe slow and deep, and let yourself drift down into the warm and gentle dark. Sleep well, traveler. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake renewed. Sleep well, and good night.